Welcome. Tonight we drift gently into the life of Lady Diana, easing into a world of soft morning light over old English fields and long corridors inside quiet country houses. The air feels still, as if holding its breath, while the future Princess of Wales begins her story far from palaces and crowds. Most people wouldn't last a week in this palace of expectation she would one day enter, but for now we linger in the simplicity of her early years, before the world ever knew her name. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel awake enough, share your location and your local time in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Diana Frances Spencer came into the world on a warm July day in 1961 at Park House in Sandringham. The house sat low against the gentle English landscape, and inside the newborn Diana was wrapped in the kind of family history that had been in motion long before she opened her eyes. Her family, the Spencers, had served and interacted with the monarchy for generations. That well-known fact often makes people assume her upbringing was all polished floors and perfect manners, but life at Park House felt far more human. There were echoes of laughter from siblings running through rooms, the occasional slam of a door after childish disagreements, and the steady rhythm of seasons changing across the estate's large fields. One small quirky detail that often surprises people is that Diana loved to collect small random trinkets even as a child, shells, ribbons, odd buttons, keeping them in little boxes she hid around her room. It was her quiet way of creating order in a world that sometimes felt uncertain. Historians still argue whether these early tendencies toward sentimentality were shaped by her family environment or simply part of who she naturally was. Her childhood environment carried the mixed scent of wood polish and open countryside. Park House was comfortable without being extravagant, and the Spencer children were encouraged to play outdoors, muddy knees and all. Diana was said to be a gentle child, easily delighted by simple things. She loved animals, sometimes spending longer hours with the family's ponies than with people. Those who knew her as a young girl often remembered her empathy most clearly. She had a soft way of noticing when someone felt left out or upset, even at a young age. Yet beneath that gentle exterior, her world wasn't entirely peaceful. Her parents' relationship had been growing strained for some time, and even though Diana was still small, she sensed the quiet tension that hung in certain rooms. The arguments, when they came, were muffled through thick walls, softened by distance, but still unmistakable. For a child, these shifts in atmosphere left their mark, shaping how she learned to read the moods of others, a skill that later made her seem so emotionally intuitive in the public eye. In school, she remained a shy but observant girl. Teachers recalled her as someone who preferred calm corners over being the center of attention. She did well in the arts, music, ballet, drawing, rather than academic subjects. There's an old story, unconfirmed but often repeated, that she once hid behind a piano during a school recital simply because she felt overwhelmed by the crowd. Whether fully true or slightly embellished, it aligns with the early patterns of her personality. She was present, kind, eager to please, but easily shaken by too much pressure. Still, Diana experienced moments of carefree childhood joy. She spent hours playing make-believe games with her siblings, crafting stories in the garden, or racing across lawns. She also adored swimming and could stay in the water far longer than anyone else in her family. These moments formed the soft foundation of her life, simple routines, gentle habits, and the comforting familiarity of home. But home itself changed dramatically when her parents' marriage deteriorated. By the time Diana was 6, the household had become noticeably divided. Her mother left after the divorce, and while Diana stayed with her father, the emotional shift affected her deeply. Historians still argue whether the separation created in her a lifelong sensitivity to rejection, but what's clear is that she developed an instinct for comfort-giving, perhaps because she knew what it felt like to need it. As she moved between visits with each parent, she experienced 2 different versions of home. Her mother's place was more spontaneous, lively, and filled with bursts of warmth. Her father's home remained structured, quieter, and rooted in tradition. Diana drifted gently between these worlds, learning to adapt with grace. It also taught her the early art of balancing expectations, something that would later become a defining part of her public life. Even with the emotional turbulence, there were bright moments that shaped her character positively. She loved music, often playing the piano softly in the afternoons. She enjoyed dancing, letting movement express what words sometimes couldn't. And she developed a quiet sense of compassion that revealed itself in small acts, helping younger children at school, comforting a crying friend, or simply offering a smile to someone who seemed anxious. One well-known fact from her early years is that she dreamed of becoming a ballerina, even practicing late into the evening sometimes. But as she grew taller, much taller than most dancers her age, she realized the dream might not fit the reality. Still, she kept her love of dance close to her, revisiting it later in life in moments of joy and expression. The countryside around Park House offered her something precious, a sense of space. On early mornings, while dew still rested on the grass, she would walk with the ponies, or wander quietly through the fields. These moments of solitude helped her form the reflective nature that would stay with her. As Section 1 comes to a close, the world around young Diana remains small but tender, filled with hints of the compassion and resilience she would one day show on a global stage. Childhood had given her softness and awareness, along with the subtle fractures that would shape the rest of her story. The echoes of childhood still lingered softly around Diana as she entered the years shaped most deeply by her parents' unraveling marriage. The tension inside their home didn't come from raised voices alone. Sometimes it slipped into the quietest details, like a long pause at the dinner table, or the way footsteps moved more sharply down a hallway. For a child who already felt emotions with unusual depth, these small shifts carried the weight of storms. Her parents, Johnny Spencer and Frances Roche, had once shared a hopeful beginning, but the relationship had grown strained over time. Diana, sensitive and observant, started noticing things before she fully understood them. Rooms that once felt warm seemed cooler. Conversations shortened. Her mother's laugh appeared less often. And although adults around her tried to cushion the situation, children sense what others think they hide. Historians still argue whether Diana's lifelong empathy developed as a response to these early fractures, or whether it was simply something she was born with. One well-known fact about this period is that the divorce between her parents became one of the most publicized aristocratic separations of its time. Newspapers followed the story with a level of attention that felt intrusive, even though Diana herself remained tucked away from the spotlight. The world only knew the broad strokes. What Diana felt inside those walls was something far more personal and quiet. A small, quirky detail often shared is that during these tense years, Diana loved rearranging furniture in her room. Nothing dramatic, just shifting a chair or moving a lamp. It was her childlike attempt to create control in a space where much felt uncertain. She was still young, but she already understood that surroundings could shape feelings. As the marriage continued to crumble, the house held a growing sense of imbalance. Diana saw her mother cry at times, and she saw her father retreat into silence. She adored both parents deeply, which made the shifting loyalties confusing. During one summer, she began writing short notes that she slipped under her siblings' doors, simple little lines like, "I'm here if you're sad." It wasn't something she boasted about. It was simply her nature. The moment her mother left the home marked a turning point. Diana was only 6, and the separation carved a deep groove in her emotional world. She stayed primarily with her father at Althorpe, but she visited her mother often. Each transition between homes felt different. Her father's home steady but distant, her mother's warm but unpredictable. Moving between two emotional climates taught her something she would rely on later: the ability to read a room instinctively and adapt with grace. Despite the turmoil, Diana's days still included simple childhood joys. She would race with her siblings across the lawns, her laughter rising and falling like the wind. She adored animals and often sought comfort in their uncomplicated presence, spending long minutes brushing ponies or feeding small pets she insisted on caring for herself. She confided in them quietly, whispering thoughts she didn't always share with adults. School became a world of its own, a mix of refuge and challenge. At Riddlesworth Hall and later West Heath School, she found structure. She enjoyed being around other children, though she remained shy and soft-spoken. Teachers often described her as someone who tried wholeheartedly, even when her academic results weren't exceptional. She excelled in dancing and music, finding freedom in movement and melody. There were stories of her taking extra ballet classes in the evenings, practicing until her toes reddened. A well-known fact about this period is that the divorce between her parents became one of the most publicized aristocratic separations of its time. Newspapers followed the story with a level of attention that felt intrusive, even though Diana herself remained tucked away from the spotlight. The world only knew the broad strokes. What Diana felt inside those walls was something far more personal and quiet. She was still young, but she already understood that surroundings could shape feelings. As the marriage continued to crumble, the house held a growing sense of imbalance. Diana saw her mother cry at times, and she saw her father retreat into silence. She adored both parents deeply, which made the shifting loyalties confusing. During one summer, she began writing short notes that she slipped under her siblings' doors, simple little lines like, "I'm here if you're sad." It wasn't something she boasted about. It was simply her nature. The moment her mother left the home marked a turning point. Diana was only 6, and the separation carved a deep groove in her emotional world. She stayed primarily with her father at Althorpe, but she visited her mother often. Each transition between homes felt different. Her father's home steady but distant, her mother's warm but unpredictable. Moving between two emotional climates taught her something she would rely on later: the ability to read a room instinctively and adapt with grace. Despite the turmoil, Diana's days still included simple childhood joys. She would race with her siblings across the lawns, her laughter rising and falling like the wind. She adored animals and often sought comfort in their uncomplicated presence, spending long minutes brushing ponies or feeding small pets she insisted on caring for herself. She confided in them quietly, whispering thoughts she didn't always share with adults. School became a world of its own, a mix of refuge and challenge. At Riddlesworth Hall and later West Heath School, she found structure. She enjoyed being around other children, though she remained shy and soft-spoken. Teachers often described her as someone who tried wholeheartedly, even when her academic results weren't exceptional. She excelled in dancing and music, finding freedom in movement and melody. There were stories of her taking extra ballet classes in the evenings, practicing until her toes reddened. A well-known fact about this period is that the divorce between her parents became one of the most publicized aristocratic separations of its time. Newspapers followed the story with a level of attention that felt intrusive, even though Diana herself remained tucked away from the spotlight. The world only knew the broad strokes. What Diana felt inside those walls was something far more personal and quiet. She was still young, but she already understood that surroundings could shape feelings. As the marriage continued to crumble, the house held a growing sense of imbalance. Diana saw her mother cry at times, and she saw her father retreat into silence. She adored both parents deeply, which made the shifting loyalties confusing. During one summer, she began writing short notes that she slipped under her siblings' doors, simple little lines like, "I'm here if you're sad." It wasn't something she boasted about. It was simply her nature. The moment her mother left the home marked a turning point. Diana was only 6, and the separation carved a deep groove in her emotional world. She stayed primarily with her father at Althorpe, but she visited her mother often. Each transition between homes felt different. Her father's home steady but distant, her mother's warm but unpredictable. Moving between two emotional climates taught her something she would rely on later: the ability to read a room instinctively and adapt with grace. Despite the turmoil, Diana's days still included simple childhood joys. She would race with her siblings across the lawns, her laughter rising and falling like the wind. She adored animals and often sought comfort in their uncomplicated presence, spending long minutes brushing ponies or feeding small pets she insisted on caring for herself. She confided in them quietly, whispering thoughts she didn't always share with adults. School became a world of its own, a mix of refuge and challenge. At Riddlesworth Hall and later West Heath School, she found structure. She enjoyed being around other children, though she remained shy and soft-spoken. Teachers often described her as someone who tried wholeheartedly, even when her academic results weren't exceptional. She excelled in dancing and music, finding freedom in movement and melody. There were stories of her taking extra ballet classes in the evenings, practicing until her toes reddened. A well-known fact about this period is that the divorce between her parents became one of the most publicized aristocratic separations of its time. Newspapers followed the story with a level of attention that felt intrusive, even though Diana herself remained tucked away from the spotlight.
Growing up at Althorpe meant Diana lived in a world that looked grand from the outside, but felt far more complicated on the inside. The estate stretched wide across fields, lakes, and quiet groves, and its long stone pathways carried the weight of centuries of Spencer history. To visitors, it might have looked like a place where everything stayed polished and perfectly arranged, but for Diana it was a mixture of comfort, loneliness, and slow emotional shifts that shaped her understanding of family and home. She lived between two worlds without fully belonging to either. On one side, there was the aristocratic expectation that surrounded her family name, a legacy of formality, tradition, and duty. On the other side, there was her own emotional landscape, shaped by the turbulence of her parents' divorce and the lingering sense that something in her life had cracked open before she had the words to explain it. Historians still argue whether this contrast between expectation and emotion was what later made her so relatable to the public. But whatever the cause, the duality became part of her foundation. A well-known fact about the Spencers is that their connection to the royal family dated back generations. Portraits of ancestors who had served the monarchy hung along the walls, their eyes following anyone who passed through the long corridors. Diana grew up seeing them every day. Some of the portraits felt comforting, almost familiar, while others seemed to watch her with a seriousness she didn't yet understand. Those quiet faces represented a world she would eventually enter, but at this age the thought of royal life was a distant echo. Despite the estate's grandeur, Diana's favourite parts of Althorpe were the gentle places. She loved the lake, where she often sat on the sloping grass, letting her shoes fill with dew on early mornings. She loved the stables, where she brushed the ponies in slow, thoughtful strokes. She loved the hidden corners in the gardens, where she could sit and read without interruption. These small sanctuaries became her escape from the emotional noise she didn't know how to untangle. One quirky detail often shared from this period is that Diana used to eavesdrop on birds. She once tried to identify each type by the sounds they made, scribbling little notes in a childish notebook. Her siblings joked that she took it far too seriously, but she insisted on listening. It soothed her, and in those quiet moments she felt grounded. The world seemed gentler when she was surrounded by nature. Her teenage years were shaped by changes at home, including the introduction of her stepmother, Rain. Diana didn't adjust easily. Their relationship began with friction, and Diana struggled against the feeling that her world was shifting without her permission. The changes in the house, new furniture, new routines, new rules, felt like intrusions. At times she vented her frustration in ways she later looked back on with a mixture of humor and regret. But the young Diana was still learning how to manage emotions she felt intensely. School offered structure, but not always comfort. At West Heath she was known for her kindness more than her academic performance. She worked hard, but wasn't naturally drawn to lectures or exams. Instead, she gravitated toward activities that allowed expression. Dance classes, choir practices, and social events where she could be among people. Her warmth made her well-liked, though she remained soft-spoken. Classmates remembered her as someone who remembered birthdays, who offered hugs on bad days, who laughed easily even when she wasn't feeling her best. The schools she attended aimed to shape young women of her social background into versions of poise and confidence. Yet Diana, despite her polite manners, still felt shy in large groups. She was tall for her age, which sometimes made her feel out of place. One teacher noted that she often slouched slightly, as if trying to make herself appear smaller. It wasn't that she disliked attention, she simply wasn't sure she deserved it. That quiet uncertainty would continue to follow her into adulthood. Historians still argue whether Diana's uneven academic performance came from a lack of interest or from the emotional distractions she carried with her.
What is clear is that she showed determination in other areas. When she wanted to learn something, like mastering a dance routine or preparing a school event, she worked with quiet perseverance. Her friendships during this time provided some of her happiest memories. She formed close bonds with girls who appreciated her humor and sincerity. Diana loved making others laugh, sometimes using playful jokes or small pranks. She wasn't rebellious in the dramatic sense, but she did enjoy harmless mischief. Once she and a friend scattered flower petals down the dormitory hallway just to see if teachers would believe a mysterious breeze had carried them inside. The prank didn't fool anyone, but it became one of those small stories retold throughout the school. As she grew older, her sense of responsibility deepened. She helped younger students settle in, sometimes sitting with them during homesick moments. She volunteered for small tasks with a calm patience that impressed those around her. But even with her caring nature, she felt moments of isolation. When she lay in bed at night listening to soft footsteps outside her dorm room, she sometimes wondered what her future would look like. She didn't imagine fame or royalty. She imagined a warm family, a home filled with stability and kindness, things she had longed for since childhood. By the time she turned 16, Diana was moving gently but steadily into young adulthood. She was neither rebellious nor rigidly traditional. She was simply a girl balancing the quiet ache of her past with the hopeful curiosity of her future. She dreamed of becoming a dancer, a teacher, perhaps even a nanny. She wanted a life rooted in care and connection. Her world, however, was beginning to shift again in subtle ways. Friends noticed her confidence increasing, especially in settings where she felt safe. Teachers began to see her leadership qualities emerge during group activities. And at home, Althorpe remained a place of contradictions, beautiful yet complicated, grounding yet filled with emotional echoes. As this section draws to a close, Diana stands at the threshold of the society world she will soon enter, still shaped by the duality of privilege and uncertainty. Her childhood at Althorpe taught her to navigate between expectations and feelings, a skill she would soon need more than she could imagine.
As Diana moved into her later teens, the doors of society began opening just wide enough for her to peek inside. These were the years when she shifted from being a quiet girl wandering the grounds of Althorpe to a young woman beginning to find her place in a much larger world. She was still shy, still gentle, but now her life carried new rhythms. School dances, small gatherings, and the first hints of the social expectations tied to her background. The transition wasn't loud or dramatic. It happened gradually, like a slow sunrise warming the edges of her daily life. At West Heath, she grew more comfortable among her peers. She found her own style, simple, soft, often featuring sweaters a size too large. She didn't strive to be glamorous. She just wanted to feel like herself. Her teachers noticed more confidence in her posture and tone, especially when she was helping others. She seemed to shine quietly, almost without noticing it herself. A well-known fact from this period is that Diana didn't complete her formal schooling. She left West Heath at 16, which surprised some people who expected her to continue. But academic study had never been her strongest area, and she was eager to step into real life. Historians still argue whether this decision came from her desire for independence or from the emotional weight she had been carrying for years. Whatever the reason, it marked a practical turning point. She felt ready to move forward. Her teenage years included moments of light-hearted fun that showed her playful nature. At gatherings with friends, she often danced freely, laughing in that warm, breathy way people later came to admire. She didn't seek attention, but she drew it naturally. People liked being around her. She listened closely, she remembered details, and she had a soft humor that made conversations feel safe. One quirky detail from this time is how much she loved rom-coms and sentimental films. She watched them repeatedly, sometimes mouthing lines she knew by heart. Her siblings teased her, but she didn't mind. Those stories gave her a sense of comfort, little windows into the happy, stable relationships she quietly hoped to have one day. By 16, Diana was spending more time in London, especially at her mother's home in the city. The contrast between Althorpe's quiet countryside and London's noise fascinated her. She loved watching people cross busy streets, loved the variety of shops, and loved the possibility that the city seemed to hold. She took ballet and tap lessons there, trying to cling to her dream for as long as she could, even though she had already begun to accept that her height would eventually keep her from becoming a professional dancer. Her friends often remarked on how naturally caring she was. At school breaks or family gatherings, she drifted toward anyone who looked left out or uncomfortable. She didn't do it for praise. It was simply instinct. That instinct would later define her public legacy, but at this age it was just part of being Diana. She attended a finishing school in Switzerland briefly, but she didn't stay long. The atmosphere felt too strict, too detached from what she wanted. She returned to England with a clearer sense of who she was, not rebellious, but not easily molded either. She preferred warmth to formality, sincerity to etiquette. These years also brought her first steps into the social circles connected to her family. Diana went to dances, charity events, and small gatherings where young aristocrats met, mingled, and learned the unspoken rules of their world. She felt a bit awkward at first. The polished confidence of others sometimes intimidated her, but she adapted quickly. She learned how to hold conversations with adults, how to manage attention gracefully, and how to blend humor with politeness. She never pretended to be someone she wasn't. Instead, she brought her own quiet authenticity, which made her stand out. At home, Althorpe remained both a refuge and a reminder of her family's complexities. Her relationship with her stepmother was improving slightly, though still bumpy. She continued to navigate these shifts with the quiet resilience she had developed throughout her childhood. She also grew closer to her father, who admired her kindness even if he didn't always understand her emotional depth. During holidays and summer breaks, Diana balanced time between social events and peaceful moments alone. She would sit by the lake or wander through gardens, wondering what the future held. She didn't envision becoming a princess or a global icon. Her dreams were simple: a loving family, meaningful work, and a life where she could care for others. Her first small taste of public life came through charity involvement and local events. She wasn't on magazine covers or television screens yet, but she was learning how to move through spaces where eyes watched and expectations formed. It was gentle training for the life that waited just beyond the horizon. Historians still argue whether Diana was consciously preparing for a role in the public sphere, or simply following the natural paths available to a young woman of her background. But what's undeniable is that these teenage years shaped her ability to be both poised and deeply human at the same time. As this section closes, Diana stands at the edge of adulthood. No longer the shy girl hiding behind the piano at school recitals, but not yet the woman the world would come to love. She is quietly growing, quietly observing, and quietly becoming someone whose heart would shape her destiny in ways she could never imagine.
Diana's step into early adulthood began with a gentle but determined search for independence. She didn't want to rely solely on her family name or drift through society events without purpose. She wanted real work, real responsibility, and a daily rhythm she could build with her own hands. By 18, she had made up her mind. She would forge a life for herself in London, modest and ordinary in many ways, but hers. She moved into a shared apartment in Earl's Court, a lively part of the city filled with young people trying to figure out their place in the world. The building wasn't grand. It was warm, slightly cluttered, and filled with the familiar noise of roommates cooking late dinners, playing music, and talking long into the night. Diana loved it. She cleaned the flat often, sometimes too often, according to her friends, and brought fresh flowers into the kitchen just to brighten the space. That small, quirky detail stuck with the people who lived with her. They used to say the apartment felt different when Diana walked into a room, as if she carried her own soft sunlight with her. A well-known fact from this period is that she worked several small jobs before anyone in the world imagined she might one day become a princess. Her most notable work was as a nanny and a part-time nursery assistant. She adored children, and the feeling was mutual. She read stories with exaggerated voices, crawled on the floor to play games, and tied shoelaces with patient care. The families she worked for remembered her as gentle, responsible, and genuinely delighted by the simple routines of caring for little ones. Her mornings often started early. She would take the bus through grey London streets, her cheeks pink from the cold, her blonde hair tucked neatly under a scarf. She enjoyed the rhythm of city life, people rushing, vendors calling out, buses rolling by in an endless pulse. It was far from the countryside quiet of Althorpe, but it made her feel alive and connected. Historians still argue whether Diana's choice to take on such modest work came from a desire to escape aristocratic expectations or from a natural calling toward caretaking. Perhaps it was both. She liked earning her own money, she liked feeling capable, and she liked being around children whose simple honesty made the world feel less complicated. During this time, she also worked as a dance instructor for young children, helping them with beginner ballet steps. Even though she had stepped away from her own dream of becoming a professional dancer, she found joy in guiding others. She moved through the studio with quiet grace, demonstrating steps with pointed toes and soft arms. The little ones adored her, tugging at her sleeves and asking endless questions. Outside of work, life in Earl's Court was lively. Diana shared the flat with 3 friends who were close to her age. They teased each other, shared clothes, and planned small outings when money allowed. They cooked pasta dinners, hosted occasional movie nights, and stayed up laughing about things that would seem trivial the next morning. Diana's happiness in those early London years came from these small freedoms. She could buy groceries, pay rent, ride the underground, and make her own choices without being overshadowed by her family's expectations. One charming, lesser-known detail is that she loved visiting local thrift shops. She enjoyed hunting for inexpensive vintage pieces, sometimes returning home with a quirky scarf or a second-hand jacket that she styled in ways only she could pull off. Her friends recalled how she would model outfits in front of the mirror with playful poses, then burst into shy laughter when someone complained that she looked too chic to be buying things for a few pounds. Despite her cheerful exterior, she still carried traces of the emotional complexities from her childhood. At night, when her roommates had gone quiet, she sometimes sat by the window with a cup of tea, looking out at the glowing city lights. She wondered about her future, whether she would marry young, whether she would find someone who understood her, whether she would ever feel fully settled. These quiet contemplations shaped her inner world as much as her busy days did. Life in London also meant attending occasional social gatherings, though she often felt out of place. She wasn't drawn to loud parties or smoky rooms filled with strangers. Instead, she preferred small dinners, soft conversations, and evenings spent talking with friends about hopes, fears, and future plans. People gravitated toward her openness. She was a good listener, and her gift for empathy made others trust her quickly. It was around this time that she began reconnecting, in a casual, distant way, with the broader social circle surrounding the royal family. Her older sister, Sarah, had briefly been linked romantically with Prince Charles, which placed Diana on the fringe of royal gatherings occasionally, but never at the centre. She didn't pursue attention. She was simply present, a friendly and graceful young woman moving through her own life. One evening she attended a gathering where Prince Charles was also present. It wasn't a romantic moment, not yet, but it was the beginning of a quiet thread that would soon pull her into a world she never expected to enter. At the time, she didn't think much of it. She laughed at a joke he made, exchanged a few polite words, and then went home to her shared flat, where she changed into pyjamas, washed her face, and joined her friends on the couch for a late-night snack. During those early London years, Diana also became more aware of the social pressures around young aristocratic women, who they should marry, how they should behave, and what kind of future they were expected to seek. But she kept her independence close. She wasn't in a rush. Her focus was on living quietly, working hard, and discovering what kind of person she really wanted to be. Historians still argue whether these years were the happiest of her life, a time before the spotlight, before the weight of public expectations settled on her shoulders. Many of her friends believed they were. She was grounded, surrounded by people who saw her simply as Diana Spencer, not as a symbol or an icon. As this section comes to a close, she stands on the edge of a future she cannot yet imagine. She is still the young woman who takes the bus to work, folds children's coats neatly on classroom hooks, and laughs with her roommates over burnt toast. But just beyond this simple, tender chapter, her life is preparing to shift in a way that will change everything. The small habits she picked up in her new royal home became part of her daily rhythm, shaping her sense of purpose long before the grand ceremonies ever reached her. She liked to start mornings by peeking out from behind heavy curtains to see if the gardens were quiet or if early staff were already moving about. Sometimes she greeted them with a shy wave, and they smiled back, almost surprised by the simple kindness. It was during these soft mornings that she felt the contrast between the world she had known and the one she was entering. Even the air seemed different here, wrapped in formality and expectation. Yet she kept leaning into these moments with her natural gentleness, carving out a space where she could breathe. She was becoming increasingly aware that her relationship with Charles was watched closely from every direction.
When they appeared together in public, cameras clicked in bursts, trying to capture meaning in every glance. One well-known fact from that time is how quickly the public embraced her. Crowds cheered when she stepped out of cars, and newspapers filled their pages with her smiling face. The fascination was immediate and intense. Still, she tried to stay grounded, sometimes joking with her sisters about how surreal everything felt. A quirky little detail from those days is that she kept a tiny stuffed animal on her bed, a silent reminder of childhood she hadn't fully outgrown. She never mentioned it publicly, but it comforted her when the palace halls felt too large. Her wedding preparations began to swell around her like a rising tide. Dresses were fitted, schedules arranged, and protocols rehearsed. She tried to move through it with calm acceptance, though there were moments when she felt the weight of it pressing against her chest. Historians still argue whether she fully understood the magnitude of her role before the engagement announcement, or whether the reality hit only afterward, when every decision suddenly had national significance. Either way, she kept going, focusing on the details she could control. Sometimes she slipped into the music room to practice piano, letting simple melodies settle her nerves. As the engagement became public, her life changed overnight. She could no longer walk unnoticed through a shop or take a quiet stroll in the park. Paparazzi followed constantly, shouting her name, hoping for a reaction. She tried to stay polite, though the sudden noise often rattled her. She called her family almost every evening, grounding herself in their familiar voices. They reminded her that beneath everything she was still the girl who wore mismatched socks and burst into giggles for no reason. Her charity work began even before the wedding, sparked by genuine interest rather than obligation. She visited schools, hospitals, and community centers with a soft, attentive presence. Children warmed to her instantly, taking her hand without hesitation. She had a gift for making people feel seen, a quality that would later define her global legacy. A memory from that early period shows her leaning down to adjust a young boy's shoelaces during a public event, unaware that cameras were quietly capturing the moment. The image later spread widely, reinforcing her image as compassionate and down-to-earth. Evenings often stretched long, filled with dinners, briefings, and lessons on royal etiquette. These sessions sometimes overwhelmed her, though she took them seriously. She practiced signatures, greetings, and even how to exit a car gracefully, a detail that amused her sisters when she recounted the lessons. She laughed with them over the phone, the sound a release from the formality surrounding her. She often said she wished she could whisk them into her room just to sit on the floor and chat the way they used to. The palace staff began to understand her rhythms. They noticed how she liked to walk through the corridors without much fuss, offering small smiles and soft greetings. She preferred simple meals when she could choose them, and sometimes snuck into the kitchen to pour her own tea. The staff found this endearing, though it broke tradition. But Diana was never overly interested in tradition for tradition's sake. She valued comfort, authenticity, and emotional connection far more. Charles, meanwhile, kept a busy schedule, filled with duties and commitments that often pulled him away. Their interactions varied from warm to distant depending on the day. She tried to bridge gaps with patience, though uncertainty sometimes lingered in the background. She kept herself busy with letters, notes, and her growing list of charitable interests. She journaled quietly at night, writing down her thoughts in a looping, expressive script. Public events intensified as the wedding approached. She smiled through rehearsals, waved at crowds, and tried on her famous wedding gown again and again as adjustments were made. She would sometimes trace the embroidery with her fingers, marvelling at how delicate it was. The scale of it all was extraordinary, and she felt both excitement and apprehension intertwining inside her. Staff whispered about how poised she seemed, but inside she wrestled with the enormity of the life unfolding ahead. Despite the pressure, there were moments of softness that she held close. A horse in the royal stables that nudged her shoulder affectionately. A lady-in-waiting who brought her a cup of tea on a difficult morning. A handwritten letter from a young girl who admired her kindness. These small gestures stitched themselves into her memory, reminders that human connection still had space within the structured world she was entering. As the wedding day drew near, she found herself looking out over the palace gardens more often, watching the leaves sway in quiet patterns. She wondered what her life would look like in a year, in 5 years, in 20. Sometimes the possibilities felt bright, sometimes they felt overwhelming. But she continued forward, step by step, carried by a mix of duty, love, and hope for a future she could help shape. And so her life, still gently unfolding, began edging closer to the moment the entire world would be watching. Her days became chapters in a story she was learning to navigate, one breath at a time, without losing the softness of the girl she had always been. The morning of the wedding rose quietly for her, even though the world outside was already buzzing. She woke before her alarm, the room washed in a soft grey light that filtered through heavy curtains. For a moment she lay still, listening to the muffled sounds of preparation somewhere deep in the palace. It felt like the world was holding its breath. She took a slow sip of the tea her attendant brought in, letting the warmth settle her. Despite the excitement and nerves tangling inside her, there was a strange calm in the air, as if time had softened its edges just for her. Preparations continued around her in gentle waves. Makeup artists moved with quiet precision. Hairdressers pinned and smoothed, and dressmakers made their final checks on the voluminous gown resting nearby. One well-known fact from that day is how the gown's long train, stretching over 25 feet, became one of the most iconic images of the era. Its silk and lace shimmered under the soft light, giving it an almost storybook glow. She touched the fabric lightly, thinking about how surreal it all felt. A quirky little detail from that morning is that she accidentally spilled a few drops of perfume on the gown and tried to hide the spot with her hand for a moment, whispering a hopeful laugh that it would go unnoticed. It did. Her sisters hovered close, offering gentle jokes and brief hugs. Their presence steadied her. They weren't thinking of cameras or ceremony. They were thinking of her, the little sister they'd shared rooms and secrets with. Historians still argue whether she felt fully prepared emotionally for this new role, or whether she stepped into the ceremony with more uncertainty than the public ever realized. What is clear is that she tried her best to move with grace, even as her heart beat faster than she let on. As she stepped into the carriage, she felt the weight of the gown settle around her like a great cloud of fabric. Crowds lined the streets in thick, cheering waves. Flags fluttered. Bells rang. The hum of excitement carried all the way through the city. She kept her hands steady, reminding herself to breathe slowly. She glanced at the horses ahead, admiring their calmness. They had been trained for noise, movement, pressure, yet they simply trotted forward, unbothered. She wished, just for that moment, she had the same training.
When she entered the cathedral, the size of the space wrapped around her, the music filled every corner, and faces turned toward her like flowers tracking sunlight. She held on to the practiced steps, lifting her chin, moving carefully so the train followed smoothly behind. She felt both present and far away, as if watching herself from a balcony above. The vows passed in a blur, phrases she had rehearsed but now heard floating around her in the echoing dome. After the ceremony, the carriage procession continued through the city, with crowds cheering loudly enough that she could feel the vibrations in her chest. She waved gently, sometimes meeting the eyes of children perched on their parents' shoulders. That, more than anything else, made her smile, the pure excitement in their faces. She would remember those small expressions long after the day's grandness faded. When she finally returned to the palace for the balcony appearance, she felt the day's weight settle along her shoulders. She stepped out beside Charles, the sunlight bright and warm. The roar of the crowd surged once more, a sea of sound that felt almost alive. She waved, smiled, and tried to take in the moment as something real, something belonging to her life rather than just the world's imagination. She noticed the guards trying not to grin too much, the small cluster of staff members watching from windows, the unexpected softness of the summer air. Later, at the reception, she allowed herself a few quiet minutes away from the ballroom. She slipped into a side room, removed her shoes, and let her feet rest on the carpet. It was a small rebellion against the perfection of the day. A staff member found her and asked gently if she needed anything, and she just smiled and said, "Only a moment." She knew she would carry images of this day forever: the train, the bells, the sea of people, the strange mixture of joy and uncertainty. As the evening continued, she danced, greeted guests, and accepted endless congratulations. She felt the celebration swirling around her like a warm current. She wondered how different tomorrow would feel, and the next day, and the next year. She wondered how she and Charles would shape their world together, and whether she would find steady footing in the life that had now officially begun. She returned to her rooms late that night, finally removing the weight of the gown. She sat on the bed for a while, brushing a finger over the delicate lace. The palace felt hushed again, the excitement now fading into memory. She let herself exhale deeply, the first true breath she had taken all day. Tomorrow would bring new expectations, new lessons, and new pressures, but it would also bring beginnings, small, quiet beginnings she hoped she could nurture. And so, with the world now calling her a princess, she settled into the soft calm of the evening, unaware that this day would become one of the most replayed moments in modern history, and one that would forever define the mythology surrounding her life. The first days of married life unfolded inside palace walls that seemed to echo differently now, as if the corridors were adjusting to her presence. She moved through them with quiet curiosity, observing the portraits, the polished floors, and the subtle routines of staff who had worked there for decades. Though she was now a princess, she still felt like a newcomer, learning an unfamiliar language, one built on protocol, tradition, and expectations, spoken but not always explained. She took each day slowly, trying to find small pockets of comfort within the grandeur. One well-known fact from those early months is how quickly she learned that her role came with an enormous public spotlight. Crowds gathered wherever she appeared, and newspapers followed her every expression. Yet inside the palace, she often felt surprisingly lonely. Charles's schedule kept him traveling frequently, attending events, giving speeches, and fulfilling obligations that predated their marriage.
She understood the necessity of it, but the quiet hours stretched longer than she expected. She would wander into the music room or sit with her sketchbook, trying to fill the space with something gentler than Crusher. A quirky detail from that period is how she used to sneak into the kitchen late at night to make herself a simple snack, usually bread with butter or a bowl of cereal, delighting the staff who weren't used to seeing a member of the royal family appear in fluffy socks, asking where the spoons were kept. She found the kitchen comforting, a place where the world felt normal. Sometimes she chatted with the night staff, listening to stories about their families or the weather, or the foxes that crossed the lawns after dark. Her public duties expanded quickly. She visited hospitals, schools, and community centres, stepping into rooms filled with people who looked at her with hope rather than protocol. These visits became the most meaningful parts of her schedule. Children clung to her hands, patients opened up to her, and staff members confided their pride or concerns. She felt more like herself during these moments than at formal dinners or ceremonies. Historians still argue whether she naturally gravitated toward charity work because it aligned with her personality or because she was quietly searching for purpose in a world that often felt rigid. Either way, she embraced those experiences wholeheartedly. Within the palace, she tried to navigate the complex structure of royal hierarchy. She was expected to learn the correct order of precedence, the proper greetings, even how to hold her handbag in a way that allowed photographers to capture flattering angles. Some of these lessons amused her, others exhausted her. She practiced in private, laughing at her own attempts to balance decorum with the warmth she couldn't help but show. She wanted to be genuine, but she also wanted to fit in, a balancing act that would define much of her early marriage. There were happy moments, too, simple ones she treasured. She loved watching the swans glide across the palace ponds, their movements so smooth they seemed to drift on air. She enjoyed writing letters to friends she didn't see often anymore, adding stickers or small drawings in the margins like she used to as a teenager. She found comfort in animals, often visiting the stables to stroke the horses' faces or feed them carrots. One horse in particular seemed to sense her moods and nuzzled her shoulder gently whenever she stood too quietly for too long. Her relationship with Charles moved through mixed seasons. Some days felt warm and easy, filled with shared laughter or quiet dinners. Other days were distant, shaped by differences neither of them fully understood yet. She tried to bridge the spaces with patience, though uncertainty occasionally crept into her thoughts. She wrote about these feelings in her journal, tucking the book away carefully each night. The pages held her private reflections, things she rarely said aloud. As she settled into her new life, she found the palace could be both suffocating and strangely enchanting. There were evenings when she wandered into rarely used rooms just to explore, rooms lined with old books, faded wallpapers, and forgotten antiques. She liked imagining the lives of people who had stood in those spaces centuries earlier. The silence in those rooms wasn't lonely. It felt historical, almost peaceful. She sometimes whispered questions to the dim air, half expecting answers from the past. Her early months as a princess were also shaped by the press's fascination. Headlines praised her fashion, her smile, her youthfulness. She appreciated the support, but struggled with the constant pressure to appear perfect. A single expression could be misinterpreted. A single gesture could become a national discussion. She was learning that life under scrutiny required a kind of resilience she was still developing. Yet she continued forward, finding strength in the smallest things, the rustle of leaves outside her window, the laughter of children during visits, the softness of a handwritten card sent by a stranger. She held on to these details the way someone clings to stepping stones across a rushing river. As the seasons shifted, she began to understand that her life had entered a new chapter, not yet settled, not yet fully written, but already filled with moments that would shape her future. She didn't know exactly where the path would lead, but she sensed that she would walk it with a growing mixture of courage, vulnerability, and the quiet hope that she could carve a space for her own heart in this immense traditional world.
As summer unfolded around her, the palace gardens bloomed in rich greens and soft colours, offering her a retreat she came to rely on. She often stepped outside early in the morning when the lawns were still cool with dew, letting the quiet steadiness of nature settle her. The royal gardeners began greeting her with warm familiarity, and she asked questions about the plants they tended with such care. One well-known fact from this period is how she loved white roses. She paused at them every time, brushing the petals gently, as though greeting an old friend. The gardeners appreciated her interest, noting how she seemed to find calm in places others passed by quickly. Inside, her days moved between official duties and private adjustments. Public events sometimes left her drained, even when they went well. Smiling for hours, holding conversations with dozens of people, and staying perfectly composed under relentless attention was a skill she was still developing. She practiced breathing slowly afterward, sitting by her window with a cup of tea, until the tension in her shoulders eased. A quirky little detail from that time is that she kept a small, hand-sized stress ball shaped like a sun near her bedside. She squeezed it absent-mindedly while thinking or journaling, the bright little object feeling out of place in the grandeur of the palace, but perfectly suited to her personality. She also, as summer unfolded around her, the palace gardens bloomed in rich greens and soft colours, offering her a retreat she came to rely on. She often stepped outside early in the morning when the lawns were still cool with dew, letting the quiet steadiness of nature settle her. The royal gardeners began greeting her with warm familiarity, and she asked questions about the plants they tended with such care. One well-known fact from this period is how she loved white roses. She paused at them every time, brushing the petals gently as though greeting an old friend. The gardeners appreciated her interest, noting how she seemed to find calm in places others passed by quickly. Inside, her days moved between official duties and private adjustments. Public events sometimes left her drained, even when they went well. Smiling for hours, holding conversations with dozens of people, and staying perfectly composed under relentless attention was a skill she was still developing. She practiced breathing slowly afterward, sitting by her window with a cup of tea until the tension in her shoulders eased. A quirky little detail from that time is that she kept a small, hand-sized stress ball shaped like a sun near her bedside. She squeezed it absent-mindedly while thinking or journaling, the bright little object feeling out of place in the grandeur of the palace, but perfectly suited to her personality. She also began attending more royal functions alongside Charles, where she observed the subtle patterns of high society. She noticed how people shifted their posture when a senior royal entered the room, how conversations dipped and lifted like carefully choreographed waves. She tried to adapt, though she worried sometimes that her sincerity made her stand out too much. Historians still argue whether these early events shaped her later desire for more independence, or whether she already sensed from the beginning that she occupied a space somewhere between tradition and change. Despite the pressures, she continued to find joy in small interactions. At one charity event, she met a little girl who shyly offered her a sticker shaped like a star. Diana placed it on her wrist with a smile, and even though photographers didn't see it, she kept it there for the rest of the day. That tiny kindness warmed her long after the event ended. She began collecting little mementos like that,
Notes from school children, small paper crafts from patients she visited, drawings handed to her by excited fans. She kept them in a decorative box in her room, calling it her quiet treasure chest. Her bond with Charles continued to shift. Some evenings were pleasant, filled with gentle conversation or shared dinners where they talked about music or travel. Other times he seemed preoccupied, absorbed in responsibilities or personal routines she didn't fully understand. She tried to reach across the distance with patience. Still, she sometimes felt like they were two lives running side by side rather than intertwined. When she felt uncertain, she turned to her family, calling her sisters for comfort. Their light teasing and silly jokes grounded her, reminding her of who she had always been beneath the titles. As autumn approached, she found herself adjusting to the rhythms of royal life with more steadiness. She liked watching the leaves gather in soft piles along the garden paths, the shifting colours reminding her of childhood walks through forests near her old home. She thought often of her past, not out of regret, but as a way to stay connected to her core. She believed that kindness was something you carried with you, not something granted by fame or duty. The press attention intensified as her role expanded. Simple outings could turn into chaotic scenes, with photographers shouting to catch her attention. She kept her head down gently, offering small smiles, but guarding her peace where she could. Private outings became rare, and she sometimes longed for the simplicity of slipping into a shop unnoticed. Still, she tried to remain graceful, aware that many people admired her and expected warmth from her. The pressure grew, but so did her resilience, little by little. Her charity engagements continued to be the brightest parts of her routine. She visited children's wards, sitting on the floor beside patients' beds so patients would feel more comfortable. She listened carefully to families, offering empathy without judgment. Staff members were often surprised by how long she stayed at each bedside, unwilling to rush through moments that mattered. She was learning that compassion didn't need an audience, it simply needed presence. Evenings in the palace remained quiet. She read books, wrote letters, and sometimes practiced the piano. The sound echoed softly through the halls, giving the space a warmth it rarely had. She found comfort in routine, even simple ones like choosing her outfit for the next day or arranging flowers on a table. These little acts gave her a sense of control in a world shaped by protocols she hadn't chosen. As her first year of marriage continued, she sensed that she was standing at the edge of a larger transformation. There were challenges she couldn't yet name, possibilities she couldn't yet see, but she felt them, gathering like the soft rumble of distant thunder. And even as uncertainties stirred in quiet corners of her thoughts, she held on to the hope that she could shape her new life into something meaningful, something deeply her own. The world around her shifted again with the news that she was expecting her first child, a change that filled her days with a new mixture of tenderness and anticipation. She sensed it even before the official announcement, in the quiet flutter of instinct that told her life was about to stretch in ways she had never imagined. The palace staff moved with extra care around her, offering subtle assistance without making her feel fragile. She appreciated their gentleness, though she still preferred doing many things herself. She continued her morning walks through the gardens, moving slowly, letting the cool air help ease her thoughts into place. One well-known fact from this chapter of her life is how the public joyfully embraced the news of her pregnancy. Crowds gathered in even larger numbers now, eager to catch a glimpse of her, to see the beginnings of the new chapter taking shape. Letters poured into the palace, thousands of them, wishing her well, sending gifts, or simply expressing hope for her health and happiness. She read as many as she could, sometimes pausing at especially heartfelt ones that felt like small lanterns in her hands. A quirky detail from this period is how she developed a sudden fondness for simple foods she hadn't cared much about before. She craved baked potatoes with butter more than anything else. The kitchen staff joked about becoming experts in making them exactly the way she liked them. She laughed along with them, grateful for these uncomplicated pleasures in a life that rarely felt simple anymore. Her days filled with prenatal appointments, official engagements, and moments of quiet reflection. She often placed a hand gently on her belly, imagining the tiny life growing inside her. It made her feel both protective and hopeful. She wondered what kind of parent she would be, what kind of world her child would inherit, and how she could make it a kinder place. Historians still argue whether this early period shaped her deep devotion to motherhood, or whether that devotion was already ingrained in her long before becoming a parent. What is certain is that she felt an immediate, profound connection to her unborn child. Her relationship with Charles shifted once more under the weight of the coming change. Sometimes he was attentive and thoughtful, asking about her health, joining her on short walks, or bringing her small gifts he thought would make her smile. Other times he seemed distant, wrapped in duties or in concerns she couldn't quite decipher. Their conversations drifted between light-hearted moments and quiet misunderstandings. She hoped the arrival of their child might draw them closer, weaving them into a stronger unit. Throughout her pregnancy she continued her charitable engagements, though at a gentler pace. She visited maternity wards, connecting deeply with expectant mothers who shared their joys and worries with her. She spent long minutes listening, offering warm encouragement. Nurses later remarked on how naturally she interacted with people, as if she wasn't performing a royal duty at all, but simply being present with genuine empathy. She found these visits grounding, reminding her that life was full of struggles and triumphs far beyond palace gates. Her attire drew immense media attention during this period, with newspapers following every outfit. She didn't think much about fashion at first, but as the attention grew, she began using it as a quiet form of expression, choosing comfortable, soft-colored dresses that helped her feel like herself amid the scrutiny. Sometimes she joked with her ladies-in-waiting about how strange it was to have the world dissecting her sleeves or the shape of her collars. As the months passed, she found comfort in nesting, a calm, instinctive desire to prepare for the baby. She decorated the nursery with soft colors, plush toys, and delicate patterns. She ran her fingers along the edges of the crib, imagining the tiny breaths and tiny fingers that would soon fill those spaces. She carefully folded baby clothes, smiling at how small they were. She often lingered in the room even before it was finished, humming softly as she looked out the window. She also spent more time with her family, calling her sisters to update them on every little change. They teased her affectionately, saying she'd be the kind of mother who took 1,000 photos a day. She laughed, knowing they were probably right. Her father wrote her gentle letters full of advice and warmth, which she reread often. The final weeks of pregnancy brought a mixture of excitement and discomfort. She found it harder to sleep, often lying awake listening to the faint hum of the palace at night. She would place a hand on her stomach, feeling small movements beneath her palm. Sometimes she whispered soft hopes into the darkness, knowing the baby couldn't hear her yet, but feeling comforted by the act itself. When the moment finally came to go to the hospital, the world seemed to hold its breath once again. Crowds lined the streets, reporters waited anxiously, and the palace buzzed with movement. She focused on steady breathing, on staying calm, on trusting the process. And when her first child entered the world, a boy, tiny and warm, and placed gently into her arms, everything around her softened. In that first moment, she felt a clarity she had never known before. She looked at his small face and felt her heart expand in a way that startled her. In that hospital room, amid all the chaos outside, she found her greatest source of strength yet, the unmistakable beginning of her life as a mother.
And as the early months of 1982 unfolded inside the increasingly familiar rhythm of palace schedules and public duties, something softer and far more personal began to reshape Diana's world from the inside out. She was expecting her first child, and the news carried a warmth that pierced through even the coldest corners of royal tradition. It brought with it a quiet glow, a sense of purpose she had longed for since her own childhood left her wishing for stability, gentleness, and uncomplicated love. Now, she felt the beginnings of a new chapter, one that depended not on formality but on tenderness. Her pregnancy with Prince William soon became one of the most watched in the world. Cameras followed her everywhere, capturing every glance, every hand resting gently on her abdomen, every small gesture of anticipation. And while the scrutiny was intense, she also seemed to radiate a calmness that surprised even those closest to her. A well-known fact from that period is how she insisted on breaking with certain royal traditions, including her wish to give birth in a hospital rather than in the palace, something no direct heir to the throne had done before. She didn't push for change out of rebellion but out of comfort, wanting the safest and most modern environment for her child. Beneath the surface, however, the emotional challenges remained real. Her marriage was already showing early cracks, subtle but undeniable. Charles's distance, his tightly controlled routines, and the looming presence of his long-standing emotional entanglement weighed on her. Yet Diana poured herself into preparing for motherhood as if it were the one place where she could nurture the world she always wanted. Historians still argue whether the emotional strain during this time made her more protective and instinctively bonded to her unborn child, or whether her naturally gentle temperament would have led her down the same warm path regardless. As the final weeks approached, her excitement grew. She often wandered through the nursery rooms, running her fingers over fabrics, toys, and tiny clothes, imagining quiet moments with a little one who would depend completely on her. She spoke softly to her bump, hoping her voice might become a source of comfort long before birth. These were the quiet, unseen moments, tender, grounding, and entirely human, far from the world of flashing cameras and palace protocols. When the day finally came in June 1982, Diana was taken to the Lindo wing at St. Mary's Hospital. The world paused, crowds gathered, reporters jostled, and the entrance became a small universe vibrating with anticipation. Inside, though, the atmosphere was more intimate. Charles stayed close, though visibly nervous, while doctors and midwives moved with practiced calm around them. Diana, for all her youth, showed remarkable strength. Labor was long, tiring, and emotional, yet she faced it with the determination of someone who had long imagined the type of mother she wanted to be. Then came the moment the world had been waiting for. When baby William finally arrived, Diana smiled with a relief so deep it seemed to lift the entire room. She held him tightly, studying his tiny features, absorbing the reality of his presence. It is said that her first instinct was to ensure he felt warmth and reassurance, as if she understood instinctively what she had long missed in her own early years. The sight of her cradling him, just a young woman, tired, joyful, overwhelmed, became one of the most enduring images of modern royalty. A lesser-known detail from that day is that Diana actually apologized for William's weight, telling the nurses she thought he might be too big. The staff laughed gently, assuring her that he was perfectly healthy. It was a small moment of humor, but one that revealed her down-to-earth nature, even in the most formal and historic circumstances. Once they returned to Kensington Palace, Diana settled into motherhood with a dedication that surprised many within the royal household. She rejected the idea of having nannies take over completely, choosing instead to be deeply hands-on. She changed diapers, rocked William to sleep, rose in the night for feedings, and insisted on bringing him on official trips when she could. She wanted him to feel the world through her presence, not through palace walls. Diana's approach contrasted sharply with generations of royal parenting. She wanted warmth, spontaneity, simple joys, not rigid schedules. She would sit on nursery floors, surrounded by colorful toys, losing track of time while making silly faces or reading stories. She delighted in small outings, sometimes slipping out quietly with a pram, savoring moments of normalcy in a life that rarely allowed it. Those who worked around her often commented on the natural tenderness that seemed to flow effortlessly from her. Yet even as she found deep fulfillment in motherhood, the emotional distance in her marriage grew increasingly difficult to ignore. Diana often felt the silence between her and Charles widen. Even in the midst of shared parental duties, she noticed how differently they interacted with William. Her warmth contrasted with Charles's formality. though he did love his son deeply in his own reserved way. Still, it was Diana's laughter, her softness, her instinctive care that filled the nursery most of the time. When she became pregnant with Harry in 1984, she felt a familiar mixture of joy and nervousness. This time, though, she understood the rhythms better, what her body needed, what soothed her anxieties, what boundaries to set with the press. She also sensed that becoming a mother of two would give her an even stronger anchor, a small world that was hers alone, free from palace tension. The birth of Harry added a new layer of brightness to her life. She adored him instantly, just as she did William. A charming detail that later delighted biographers was that she intentionally kept Harry's gender a secret from Charles before the birth, knowing he hoped for a daughter but also knowing she simply wanted a healthy baby. And when she introduced Harry to the world, she carried the same tenderness she had shown with William, smiling softly as if shielding her newborn from the weight of global attention. By then, Diana was becoming known informally as the heart of the young royal family. Her photographs with William and Harry kneeling in the grass, clapping their hands, guiding tentative steps circulated worldwide and created a new image of royalty. Approachable, affectionate, human, she seemed most herself in those moments. A shy young woman from Althorpe evolving into a mother whose love radiated through every gesture. Her children became not only her greatest joy but also her greatest source of strength. In a world that demanded perfection, protocol, and silence, William and Harry gave her something purer, unconditional connection. She poured into them the warmth she once longed for, creating memories grounded in laughter, messiness, and closeness. They were her refuge, her purpose, her calm center amid the intensifying pressure of royal life. And with every passing day, her identity as a mother became one of the defining pillars of her story, shaping not just her private world but the public was growing understanding of who she truly was beneath the crown's heavy expectations. And as the boys grew, filling the halls of Kensington Palace with laughter and the rhythmic thumps of tiny footsteps, the contrast between the warmth Diana created for her children and the cold formality of her marriage grew sharper by the year. The palace appeared majestic from the outside, its red brick walls, its manicured gardens, its sense of order and tradition, but inside, the small fractures that had once gone unnoticed were widening into unmistakable cracks. Diana could feel them every time silence settled between her and Charles, like an extra presence in the room. In the early years, she tried with sincere effort to bridge the emotional distance. She approached conversations gently, suggested shared activities, and sought moments where they might reconnect as the couple the public imagined them to be. But Charles remained often distracted, absorbed in duties, engagements, and long-standing friendships that sometimes left Diana feeling like a distant observer in her own marriage. One well-known fact from this time is how frequently he continued contacting and spending time with Camilla Parker Bowles, a relationship that had existed long before Diana entered the picture. While the palace attempted to keep it discreet, the emotional consequences were impossible for Diana to ignore. She found herself struggling with growing insecurity, not because she lacked love to give, but because she felt increasingly unseen. At public events, she stood beside Charles, smiling at crowds, waving gracefully, creating the image of unity that the monarchy depended on. Inside, however, the sense of isolation deepened. The pressure was relentless. The clothes she wore, the way she spoke, the smallest expressions on her face, everything fed the hunger of newspapers and tabloids. Historians still argue whether the media's fixation intensified the tensions in her marriage or merely revealed fractures already too deep to mend. But the effect on Diana was unmistakable. She often sought refuge in the nursery or the gardens, spending long stretches of time with William and Harry. Their presence soothed her. In their company she felt grounded and real, free from expectations. She would kneel in the grass, letting Harry tug at her sleeves while William chatted excitedly about whatever caught his attention that day: planes, frogs, shiny toy cars. Diana held on to these moments like lifelines, savoring the simplicity they provided. Yet the palace noticed her emotional struggles. Whispers circulated among staff, advisors, and family members, some concerned, others critical, a few sympathetic. But Diana didn't need whispers. She needed understanding. Instead, she often felt judged for not fitting seamlessly into the rigid mold expected of senior royals. In private, she sometimes broke down, releasing bottled-up emotions from days spent performing perfection for the world. Charles, on his part, seemed unsure of how to respond. He cared in his own structured way, but he struggled to understand the depth of Diana's distress, and his inability to comfort her fed her growing sense of loneliness. A little-known detail from this period is how Diana sometimes visited the kitchens late at night, hoping for a quiet conversation with staff who treated her not as a symbol but as a person. She would lean against polished counters, speaking softly about small things, childhood memories, the boys' latest antics, even the weather, grateful for moments when no one expected her to be royal. The staff recalled how she often apologized unnecessarily, a habit from years of navigating a family system where she never felt quite secure. As time passed, her humanitarian work became both a source of meaning and a source of tension. Charity engagements that were once simple visits began turning into global media moments. Crowds adored her. Photographs of her shaking hands, comforting children, or simply smiling with genuine warmth spread across newspapers, overshadowing Charles's more traditional, subdued engagements. This imbalance created pressure neither of them knew how to solve. Diana didn't seek competition, but it unfolded naturally. She possessed an authenticity that resonated deeply with the public. People saw her vulnerability, her compassion, her willingness to kneel beside strangers. She made eye contact, listened, and laughed freely, breaking the invisible barrier between royalty and ordinary people. And while this made her beloved across the world, inside the palace it stirred complicated emotions not only from Charles, but from courtiers who preferred predictability over her spontaneous warmth. At home, the emotional distance grew wider. Meals were often quiet, punctuated by polite conversation rather than genuine connection. Their schedules diverged more each month, with Charles attending events that aligned with his long-standing interests, while Diana poured herself into charities focusing on children, the homeless, and those affected by illness or poverty. Through service, she found purpose. Through service, she felt seen, but the emotional toll remained heavy. She struggled with feelings that overwhelmed her, moments when she felt trapped inside an image the world adored but few truly understood. She confided occasionally in friends, sharing her fears, her doubts, and her exhaustion. She worried about raising her boys in an environment where love sometimes felt overshadowed by protocol. She worried about what the future looked like if the distance between her and Charles continued to grow unchecked. Despite the turmoil, her love for her sons strengthened her resilience. She made a quiet promise to herself: whatever happened in her marriage, she would ensure William and Harry experienced the warmth, affection, and emotional openness she once longed for. She wanted them to laugh freely, to hug without hesitation, to feel safe expressing their fears or worries. She wanted to raise princes who were also boisterous, joyful, grounded. This promise shaped countless small moments. She organized trips to amusement parks, arranged surprise outings, let them run wild in gardens, jump on sofas, splash in fountains. Even in the most formal rooms of the palace, she encouraged them to be playful. The royal household sometimes frowned upon these relaxed rules, suggesting they didn't align with tradition. But Diana held firm. She wanted her sons to experience a childhood filled with warmth, even if it meant nudging boundaries in quiet, gentle ways. And so the years went on, bright moments intertwined with shadows, public adoration mixed with private sorrow. Diana learned to navigate the contradictions, growing more aware each day that her marriage was becoming something fragile, something held together more by duty than by shared dreams. Yet she also discovered a strength within herself, a spark of independence that would soon become one of the defining features of her story. What had begun as faint cracks in the walls of palace life were now becoming unmistakable lines, widening with each passing season. And though she did not yet know how far they would spread or what they would reshape, they marked the start of a slow, irreversible change that would eventually alter not only her marriage but her identity, her future, and the path she would walk in the years ahead. And as the tension in her marriage continued its quiet, steady climb, Diana found herself standing at an unexpected crossroads, not a dramatic one marked by confrontation or declarations, but a softer, internal shift. It happened gradually, shaped by long nights of reflection and countless days of navigating the demanding rhythms of royal life. She began to sense that if she didn't create her own space, her own voice, she might disappear entirely into the expectations surrounding her. And so, gently at first, she began carving out a path that was hers alone. Her charitable work became one of the most defining parts of this growing independence. While the palace expected support for traditional causes, Diana's instincts pulled her toward places others rarely visited. One well-known fact from this time is how she became deeply involved in raising awareness about HIV and AIDS, an illness that carried immense stigma in the 1980s. She chose not only to visit patients but to sit beside them, hold their hands, and listen without hesitation. The image of her shaking hands with an HIV-positive man without gloves became a global symbol of compassion, reshaping public understanding more powerfully than any speech could have. Within the palace walls, however, her increasing popularity created mixed reactions. Some advisors admired her effect on the public. Others worried she was stealing spotlight without meaning to. Diana herself had no intention of overshadowing anyone. She simply wanted to help people who felt forgotten. Yet the attention inevitably grew, and the glow of public affection followed her everywhere, from hospitals to shelters to community centers where she sat comfortably on the floor with children, laughing with uninhibited warmth. At home, the distance between her and Charles grew not through arguments, but through silence. Their lives were moving increasingly in opposite directions. He focused on his long-standing interests: architecture, conservation, cultural institutions, while she focused on humanitarian efforts rooted in empathy. Historians still argue whether their differences might have found balance with more support and time, or whether the gap between them was already too deep to bridge. But for Diana, the reality was simple. She felt alone, and the weight of that loneliness pushed her to seek meaning outside of marriage. With William and Harry growing, she tried to shield them from any emotional strain. She built routines filled with laughter, breakfasts full of chatter, school drop-offs where she waved enthusiastically, silly games before bedtime. She wanted them to feel secure, even as she struggled to find that same sense of grounding for herself. A small, lesser-known detail from this period is how Diana sometimes slipped handwritten notes into their school bags, little messages of encouragement, doodles or reminders of how loved they were. These tiny rituals helped her stay connected to them in a world where her days were increasingly shaped by obligations. Yet even as she sought moments of peace, the press became more relentless. Photographers waited outside palace gates, trailed her car, shouted questions, and snapped pictures without pause. She could barely step outside without feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes. And as her marriage's struggles became harder to hide, the tabloids grew bolder, printing rumors, analyzing expressions, dissecting every sign of tension. Diana tried to remain composed, but the constant exposure made her feel vulnerable. She once described feeling as though she lived inside a glass box, visible from every angle, with nowhere to retreat. At times the press chased her so aggressively that she feared for her safety. And while this period wasn't yet the storm that would come later, it was the beginning of a relationship with the media that would shape her life in profound and complicated ways. Still, even amid pressure, moments of quiet clarity emerged. She realized that her strength didn't come from fitting a mold. It came from being genuine. She began speaking more openly during private conversations at charity events, listening deeply to people who felt unheard by the world. And as she listened, she found herself, her identity grew not from royal protocol, but from empathy. In these years she formed friendships that became vital support systems. Some were long-term confidants, others were new faces who offered emotional stability the palace environment sometimes lacked. They encouraged her, reminding her of her kindness, her intelligence, her resilience. Many of them later described how she lit up rooms not through glamour, but through presence, by making people feel seen. Her growing confidence didn't erase the difficulties at home, but it gave her a sense of agency she hadn't felt in years. She began choosing her own dresses with intention, allowing fashion to become a form of expression, soft pastels when she needed calm, bold colors when she needed strength. And though she didn't set out to become a style icon, the world soon looked to her for inspiration. Designers admired her natural elegance. Reporters noted how she could transform even simple outfits into statements of grace. But beneath the glamorous images was a woman trying to hold herself together. Nights were often long, filled with thoughts she couldn't quiet. She sometimes paced softly through the palace halls after everyone had gone to bed, her footsteps muffled on thick carpets. She would pause by windows, looking out at the gardens, wondering if she would ever feel understood inside the institution she had married into. And yet, even on the hardest days, she continued to show up with a smile, a gentle touch, a kind word. She found purpose in connecting with people who felt isolated or overlooked. These interactions, though small, helped her reclaim pieces of herself. They reminded her that the vulnerability she felt wasn't a weakness, it was part of what made her profoundly human. As the late 1980s approached, the contrast between her inner struggles and her public image grew sharper. The world saw a radiant princess, beloved and admired. Few saw the quiet battles, moments of doubt, flashes of sadness, the effort it took to stay strong for her children. And though she had begun stepping into her own voice, she knew the journey ahead would not be simple. But she was learning, slowly, that her worth didn't depend solely on her role as a wife or royal figure. She was discovering that she had a story outside of expectation, a purpose rooted in compassion, and a strength deeper than she once believed. The foundation of her independence was settling quietly into place, and even if she couldn't yet see the full shape of the path ahead, she could feel the beginnings of change stirring softly, steadily, like a tide preparing to rise. The palace had a way of amplifying silence. On long evenings, when official duties were over and the last polite smile of the day faded from Diana's face, she often found herself sitting near a window, watching the lights of London shimmer like distant stars. The world saw glamour, prestige, and perfection. But behind the tall windows she carried a growing awareness that the life she had entered was far more complicated than any fairy tale. It was during these early years of marriage that quiet doubts began to settle in the shadows around her. She had tried earnestly to adapt to the expectations of royal life. She learned the rhythms of ceremonies, the careful choreography of public appearances. She memorized names and titles, learned the subtleties of royal protocol, and tried to present the calm, composed image expected of her. But the deeper she moved into this world, the more she felt the weight of being watched by everyone: courtiers, advisors, and the press who waited outside the palace gates. She sensed that the fairy tale so many believed in was slowly cracking, and she was expected to pretend not to notice. Charles was often away, busy, distant, or absorbed in duties that took him across the country and abroad. Their conversations grew shorter, quieter, and sometimes disappeared altogether behind courtesy and routine. She tried to bridge the gap, offering warmth and openness, but she often felt her efforts slipping through a space neither of them could quite name. Historians still argue whether their emotional distance began early, or whether it deepened slowly. shaped by the pressures of public expectation and the impossible standards placed on both of them. In truth, it was probably a mix of both. The quirky detail that she sometimes found comfort in small, ordinary tasks, rearranging flowers, writing long letters, or sitting on the floor with William's toys long after he had gone to sleep, offered her a temporary refuge. These quiet moments reminded her that beneath the layers of royal duty, she was still a young woman trying to understand a life that was never truly designed for her. When morning came, she stepped back into the role expected of her, dressed impeccably, smiling for cameras, shaking hands, and carrying herself with grace. Yet as the months turned into years, the distance between public appearance and private feeling widened. She felt unseen inside a world where she was always looked at. But she carried on, one calm breath at a time, trying to find her place in a life that seemed to shift the moment she felt she understood it. The palace halls remained the same, grand, echoing, and lined with portraits of centuries of history, yet she felt each day stretching under the tension between what people believed and what she lived. Diana had always known the press would follow her after all. She married into a family that lived under constant public scrutiny, but she hadn't expected the intensity to evolve into something almost feral. By the mid-1980s, cameras flickered like lightning whenever she appeared. Reporters waited outside the palace gates at dawn, hoping to catch even a fleeting glimpse of her. And wherever she went, charity visits, official tours, private errands, the press followed. Sometimes inches away, sometimes shouting questions that echoed louder than they needed to. In the early years, she tried to greet them with patience. She smiled, she answered politely, and she learned how to step out of a car with grace despite flashes firing from every angle. But it didn't take long before the attention became overwhelming. Every gesture was dissected, every expression magnified. If she looked tired, headlines speculated endlessly. If she stayed quiet for a moment, rumors multiplied. Historians still argue whether the press intentionally fed into the tension already growing inside the marriage, or whether they were simply responding to public hunger for more of her life. Diana had a particularly unusual memory trick she used during public appearances, something she once joked about with close friends. She mentally divided a crowd of photographers into friendly flashes and stormy flashes, pretending the light patterns were something like weather. It was a quirky way of staying calm while dozens of strangers tried to capture every blink of her eyes. But the storms grew louder. One afternoon, while visiting a children's hospital, she stepped out of her car and immediately faced a wall of cameras. She smiled gently, nodded to the reporters, and walked past them into the building, where the energy was entirely different. Inside, the children waved at her with shy excitement. Nurses laughed softly as she kneeled beside hospital beds, listened to stories, and squeezed small hands. Moments like these grounded her. They reminded her why she pushed through the noise outside. Still, when she returned to Kensington Palace at night, the contrast between inner warmth and outer intensity felt sharper than ever. Westminster's quiet streets glowed under streetlights, but she knew photographers sometimes hid in cars or behind trees waiting for another picture. Through all this, she continued to carry herself with remarkable composure. She learned the rhythm of public life the same way she had learned palace etiquette, step by step, breath by breath, but the pressure never faded. In the quieter hours of the evening, when the palace settled into its long, slow exhale, Diana often found herself confronting thoughts she kept hidden from the world. The heavy doors closed, the footsteps of staff faded down long carpeted corridors, and the silence that followed revealed a different kind of pressure, one that didn't come from cameras or headlines, but from within. It was in these moments that she began to understand the weight of her own emotions. She was young, celebrated, and adored around the world, yet deeply uncertain about the landscape of her inner life. She had always been sensitive, intuitive, and easily moved by the people she met. These qualities had endeared her to millions, but they also meant she felt things deeply, joy and pain alike. The emotional distance in her marriage mixed with relentless public scrutiny, creating a strain that ordinary people rarely imagined. Historians still argue whether her struggles emerged gradually under this pressure, or whether they were present long before she ever walked into the glare of royal life. What is certain is that the palace was not built to hold vulnerability, it was built to hold tradition. She tried to make sense of her feelings the only way she knew how, by searching for small, grounding rituals. One unusually quirky habit she developed during this period was arranging fresh flowers in the evenings. Instead of allowing staff to handle them, she preferred doing it herself, trimming stems and refilling crystal vases while soft music played in the background. She once told a close friend that the flowers were the only things in this house that didn't judge me. It was a small act, but it gave her a sense of control when the rest of her world felt rigid and scripted. Her emotional life grew more complicated as she tried to balance personal needs with public responsibilities. She continued performing her duties gracefully: hospital visits, charity events, formal dinners, but even the most practiced smile sometimes masked a sinking feeling that she wasn't being heard or understood. She tried talking about her emotions with those around her, but conversations often vanished into polite, quiet, or practical dismissals. The royal ecosystem was structured around stability, not vulnerability. When she traveled for engagements, she sometimes found comfort in fleeting interactions with strangers. A warm handshake from a nurse, a quick conversation with a mother in a crowd, or a child who simply offered her a flower. These moments reminded her that compassion still flowed freely in the world. Many who met her later said her empathy felt startlingly genuine, like she was fully present with them even in a sea of cameras. It was both a gift and a burden. She carried other people's pain as gently as she carried her own. During this period, she also began exploring topics that helped her understand herself better: psychology, emotional well-being, and the dynamics of human relationships. She read books quietly in her room late at night, sometimes leaving them open face down on the small table beside her bed. Kensington Palace had many rooms, but this one became her private sanctuary, a place where she could set aside the demands of the crown and listen to her own thoughts without interruption. Still, she faced days when even the quiet didn't feel restful. She experienced fluctuations in mood, periods of intense self-doubt, and moments when she felt overwhelmed by the expectations placed upon her. Her struggles were real, though she rarely had the space to articulate them fully. The palace walls could hold secrets, but they also held echoes of history, echoes that sometimes made her feel even smaller. One evening, after a particularly difficult public engagement, she returned home and found herself sitting on the floor of her living room, leaning against the sofa, staring at the dim ceiling lights. She wasn't crying. She was simply tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. To ground herself, she began humming a tune from her childhood, something her nanny used to sing. The soft melody pulled her back to a simpler time, when expectations were gentle and choices were her own. She stayed there for a long while, letting the quiet melody fill the space. But despite the emotional weight of these years, she continued searching for hope in the people she helped. She discovered that connecting deeply with others eased her own burden. The more she reached out, visiting shelters, supporting mental health programs, listening to stories from those who had been overlooked, the more she felt like herself again. Each act of compassion became part of her healing, even if only for a moment. Diana's emotional challenges were not signs of weakness. They were reflections of a woman navigating a life that demanded stillness when she needed expression, perfection when she needed comfort, silence when she needed understanding. Through it all, she tried to honor her own inner voice, even when it trembled. And with that growing awareness, she stepped into the early 1990s, a different woman, still gentle, still empathetic, but no longer willing to disappear into the background. She felt something awakening in her. A quiet but unmistakable resolve that the fragments of her identity needed to be gathered and protected. The pressures around her had not vanished, and the marriage had grown colder. But Diana had begun to understand the strength she carried within her vulnerability. It was not defiance for the sake of spectacle. It was simply the instinct to survive, to claim a life that felt genuine to her. Her public duties continued, but she approached them with clearer intention. Every visit to a hospital, every conversation with a patient, every appearance at a charity event became an opportunity to create real connection. She no longer wanted to be merely a symbolic figure standing beside Charles. She wanted to be useful. She wanted to offer comfort where comfort was rare, to stand beside people who had no titles and no protection. And the more she gave, the more the public adored her. Crowds pressed closer, calling her name with an affection that felt almost familial. She became uniquely a royal who did not feel distant. But that rising adoration intensified the strain within the monarchy. Traditionalists viewed her growing independence as a challenge to the old ways, a disruption of the carefully balanced structure that defined the royal institution. She sensed the chill in the corridors of Buckingham Palace, the subtle exclusion from conversations, the undercurrent of disapproval disguised as formality. The more she shone in public, the more tension she felt at home. It was a paradox she could not escape. The qualities that endeared her to millions often made life inside the palace even more difficult. Amid this atmosphere, Diana sought companionship where she could find it. Her friendship with James Hewitt deepened, giving her emotional support in a period when she felt more alone than ever. Their bond would later spark controversy and scandal, but in those years it was simply a refuge, a space where she could speak freely, laugh freely, breathe freely. Yet even that sanctuary was shadowed by fear. The press had grown increasingly aggressive, following her every movement, capturing her every expression, and interpreting her every gesture. Privacy became a luxury she could not afford. The tabloids, ever hungry for sensationalism, began churning out stories with little regard for truth. Photographers lurked outside gates, cars, and restaurants, always waiting. Headlines speculated about her mental health, her marriage, her friendships, her weight, her motherhood, anything that could be exaggerated into a narrative. She learned to brace herself before picking up a newspaper, knowing that most days she would find some distorted reflection of her life printed on the front page. The pressure was relentless, and yet she continued, refusing to let the noise drown her compassion. Her work with HIV and AIDS charities deepened further during this period. She met with patients privately, listened to their fears, and learned about the stigma they faced, not only in society but sometimes within their own families. She held their hands, hugged them, sat beside them without gloves or hesitation, sending a message to the world. These were people deserving of dignity. It was a courageous stance at a time of widespread misunderstanding and prejudice. Her empathy often placed her ahead of public opinion, and she did not shy away from subjects others avoided. But her personal struggles grew harder to conceal. She battled bulimia and emotional turmoil, conditions that had started earlier in her marriage but grew more complex with time. She sought help through therapy, trying to understand her pain, trying to rebuild the parts of herself that felt shattered under the pressure of royal life. Those sessions offered her clarity, helping her recognize patterns of self-blame and suppressed emotion. She slowly began to articulate the needs she had never allowed herself to voice, and with each realization she grew stronger. As the early 1990s unfolded, the marriage between Diana and Charles deteriorated beyond repair. Their public appearances together felt increasingly strained, their smiles practiced and thin. Private arguments spilled into public awareness through leaks, whispers, and subtle gestures caught by cameras. Even the palace, long committed to maintaining a facade of unity, could no longer disguise the truth. The couple had become symbols of a royal image in crisis, and every observer could sense the inevitability of change. Diana, now more self-aware, recognized that she could not continue living a life defined by quiet suffering. She worried about the impact of the tension on her sons, wanting them to grow up feeling loved rather than caught between two worlds. William, growing older, began to understand more than she wished he did. Harry, younger but perceptive, sensed the shifts in mood even if he did not grasp the cause. Their innocence made her even more determined to protect their emotional well-being. In the midst of all this, she took on more causes: landmine victims, the homeless, the marginalized, seeing in their struggles reflections of her own desire to be understood and valued. She worked tirelessly, often beyond what her schedule required, finding purpose in lifting others. Her compassion was not a performance, it was a lifeline, a way of channeling the pain she carried privately into something meaningful. She knew she could not heal her own wounds overnight, but she could at least ease the suffering of others. With each step toward independence, she came closer to confronting the truth she had long tried to avoid. The life she was living could not continue unchanged. The palace walls felt narrower than ever, the expectations heavier, the silence louder. She began to envision a different future, one in which she was not constrained by protocol but guided by her own instincts. It was a fragile vision, uncertain, untested, but it was hers. And as she moved deeper into the decade, that vision would soon ignite one of the most defining moments of her public life, a moment that would echo across the world and reshape her legacy forever. That moment arrived when the walls that had held so many secrets finally cracked open, letting the world peer inside the troubled royal marriage. For years, rumors had circulated: tensions, affairs, emotional distance, but they remained, at least officially, whispers behind closed doors. Yet as Diana stepped into the mid-1990s, she reached a point where silence no longer felt like dignity. It felt like erasure. She had spent so long being spoken for, interpreted, and misinterpreted that the need to reclaim her narrative grew impossible to ignore. When she agreed to speak candidly in the now famous 1995 Panorama interview, it was not an impulsive decision. It was the culmination of years of feeling unheard, of watching her struggles become tabloid fuel, of seeing her compassion overshadowed by speculation. The interview took place in a modestly lit room, far from the grandeur of palaces, an intentional contrast to the life she was describing. She sat poised but fragile, her voice steady yet tinged with the exhaustion of someone who had carried too much for too long. Her words were direct, honest, and quietly devastating, touching on loneliness, betrayal, and the overwhelming pressures of royal existence. The world watched in astonishment. Her statement, "There were 3 people in this marriage," became instantly iconic. Quoted across headlines, talk shows, and dinner tables. Some praised her bravery, others questioned her judgment, and historians still argue whether the interview was a strategic move, a cry for help, or an act of liberation. But there was no denying its impact. For the first time, the public heard Diana without interpretation, without filters, without palace mediation. She presented herself not as a victim, but as a human being asking to be seen. The aftermath was a storm. The monarchy, already strained, reacted with caution, discomfort, and shock. Advisors debated the consequences behind closed doors, while newspapers churned out endless analyses. Diana found herself at the center of a whirlwind she had helped create, yet she did not regret speaking her truth. She felt lighter, in a strange way, even though the world grew noisier. The interview marked a turning point, and she sensed that nothing would be the same again. In the months that followed, the public perception of Diana shifted further. Many felt a renewed connection to her, admiring the honesty she displayed in a setting where discretion had been the expected norm. Crowds greeted her with even more warmth, seeing her as a woman fighting for her identity. Her humanitarian work gained new momentum, as if the clearing of her personal story made room for deeper purpose. She visited hospitals with renewed focus, met with charities addressing causes she believed in, and traveled to places where her presence brought global attention to overlooked suffering. But the increased visibility also intensified the pursuit of the press. Paparazzi seemed to multiply overnight, their presence becoming even more intrusive. Cars followed her through city streets. Photographers waited outside every building she entered. She navigated her days with heightened caution, knowing that even simple errands could become headlines. Her security team adapted constantly, creating new routes, adjusting schedules, trying to protect her from the relentless gaze. Through it all, Diana clung to her role as a mother. William and Harry remained her anchor, the two people she trusted fully. She shielded them as best she could, trying to maintain normalcy during school runs, holidays, and quiet evenings at home. She laughed with them, traveled with them, and spoke openly with them in ways she herself had not experienced as a child. She wanted them to grow up grounded, compassionate, free of the emotional isolation she had endured. Her relationship with Charles grew more distant, yet more defined. Formal duties were still shared occasionally, but the warmth had long faded. They communicated primarily about the children, working to minimize the impact of their fractured marriage on William and Harry. Despite the tension, Diana did not seek to erase Charles from their lives. She understood the importance of their father's role, and she encouraged respect, even when she struggled internally with her own feelings. As the year progressed, discussions within the monarchy began to shift. Advisors recognized that the marriage could no longer remain intact, not with the level of public exposure and private strain that now existed. The interview had forced the institution to confront a reality it could not reshape through silence. Behind closed doors, dialogues about separation resurfaced, this time more seriously and with greater urgency. Diana, meanwhile, focused on reshaping her identity. She began to explore new opportunities that aligned with her values: global health initiatives, anti-landmine campaigns, and organizations supporting the vulnerable. She attended lectures, read reports, consulted experts, and built knowledge that went beyond ceremonial involvement. She wanted to be effective, not merely symbolic. Those around her noticed the change. She carried herself with a quiet confidence that had long been hidden beneath the weight of royal expectations. One of the lesser-known aspects of this period is that she sought calmer personal spaces, small rituals that anchored her during the turbulence. She took long walks at Kensington Palace, sometimes late in the evening when the grounds were quiet. She practiced relaxation techniques recommended by her therapists, finding comfort in steady breathing and grounding exercises. She spent more time in her private sitting room, listening to soft music or writing letters by hand. These small acts offered her peace amid chaos, yet uncertainty persisted. The world speculated endlessly about her next steps, her relationships, her future within or outside the royal family. Some predicted she would withdraw from public life. Others believed she would reinvent herself entirely. What she wanted, more than anything, was clarity. And that clarity finally began to emerge as the royal institution approached a decision that would redefine her existence. Toward the end of this period, conversations about divorce became official. What had long been whispered began moving toward reality. And although she felt a sense of sorrow for what had been lost, she also felt something else rising quietly within her. Hope. Hope for independence. Hope for authenticity. Hope for a life shaped not by expectation but by choice. And as the world prepared for the changes ahead, Diana stood at the threshold of a new chapter, one that would demand resilience, courage, and an even deeper understanding of who she was beyond the crown. The first years after her divorce settled into a rhythm that felt strangely quiet compared to the storm she had walked through. Life at Kensington Palace grew steadier, almost domestic in its own way. With mornings beginning early and filled with the soft scuff of staff preparing the day, Diana often moved through those rooms in loose sweaters and comfortable trousers, sipping tea while planning her schedule. This period is remembered as one of her most independent, a time when she could choose where to focus her energy without the weight of royal protocol shaping every step. The internationally televised divorce had already made headlines, a well-known historical moment that reshaped the monarchy's public image. Yet behind closed doors, she focused on grounding herself again. There was a sense of personal renewal. She experimented with new fitness routines, took long walks in the gardens, and kept journals where she wrote down small reflections. One quirky detail from these days is how she sometimes rearranged furniture in her rooms late at night, simply because moving things around made the space feel more her own. Her closest friends noticed she laughed more freely, though they also saw the fatigue she carried after years of pressure. Historians still argue whether this was the calmest phase of her life or simply a quieter chapter between storms. But either way, she embraced it. Her bond with William and Harry deepened further, becoming the emotional anchor of her days. She cooked simple meals with them, watched movies on the floor of the sitting room, and treated their time together as sacred. She often said that motherhood helped her breathe again. The boys, growing into their teenage years, brought jokes, noisy energy, and a refreshing sense of normalcy that balanced her public responsibilities. She wanted them to see her as both a mother and a steady presence, not the global figure constantly surrounded by cameras. Yet despite craving privacy, Diana felt drawn to step further into the world. She recognized her influence, and she believed it could be used more freely now that she was no longer bound by royal schedules. She accepted invitations to international events focused on humanitarian work, especially those supporting maternity care, children in crisis zones, and communities affected by HIV and AIDS. In some countries, her visits caused crowds to spill out onto the streets, a reminder of her lingering cultural power. As she traveled, she became more selective about the organizations she aligned herself with, preferring those where she could see direct, tangible impact. New friendships entered her orbit too, some brief and some meaningful. She was drawn to people who carried a sense of devotion to their craft or to a cause. Chefs, artists, doctors, designers. She found conversation with them refreshing. These friendships often took place in private homes rather than glittering parties, where she could relax without feeling like she was being evaluated. She shared meals, cooked late at night, swapped stories, and even joked about the chaos of a public image. One friend would later recall how she playfully stuck labels on water bottles to keep track of whose drink was whose at a casual dinner. Still, the press remained relentless. Cameras followed her into gyms, onto sidewalks, and even into charity spaces where she hoped for quiet. She developed strategies to manage photographers, sometimes taking unexpected routes, sometimes stepping out briefly to offer a quick smile so they would leave. But this period also marked a shift. More people began questioning the media's constant chase. Diana had become a symbol not only of glamour or tragedy but of dignity under pressure. She understood this, though it weighed on her more than she ever admitted. Even with the stress, she continued carving out new pathways. She explored possibilities in fashion consulting, considered writing, and even imagined starting a foundation fully her own. Some of these ideas remained sketches in notebooks, but they reflected her expanding confidence. One private goal she mentioned to a friend was learning more about different world religions, believing it might help her grow spiritually. Her curiosity never stopped evolving. There were lighter moments, too. She took spontaneous trips with her sons, sang along to pop songs in cars, and laughed over silly magazine stories that exaggerated daily life. Those close to her saw a woman trying earnestly to heal, to enjoy ordinary joys, and to shape a future that felt authentic. This phase, stretching through the mid-1990s, became a turning point. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't entirely peaceful, but it carried a softness she had long been denied, a slow rebuilding of who she wanted to become next. And although no one could have predicted how short this chapter would be, it formed the emotional foundation for the whirlwind that would arrive in the following year, changing everything once again. And as the mid-1990s progressed, Diana's influence expanded beyond the walls of the palace, the UK, and even Europe. She had always cared deeply about humanitarian causes, but now, freed from many of the formal obligations that had tied her earlier, she stepped boldly into a global role that few royals had dared to claim. Her work became not just symbolic, but practical and tangible. She visited hospitals in Africa, attended refugee camps in the Middle East, and walked through communities devastated by landmines, witnessing firsthand the pain and resilience of those living in extreme conditions. One well-known fact from this time is her work raising awareness about the dangers of landmines. Culminating in several high-profile visits to mine-affected countries, she held the hands of survivors, crouched beside children, and listened to personal stories in a way that television cameras could not fully capture. She refused gloves or barriers, wanting to show that compassion should be unshielded, that humanity demanded presence and warmth. The images of her interacting with victims circulated worldwide, cementing her reputation as a royal who transcended ceremonial roles. Behind the public appearances, she carried a private intensity. Diana would often spend hours reading reports, learning about local challenges, and thinking about long-term solutions. She was meticulous in planning visits, sometimes insisting on routing logistics herself so that she could see conditions accurately rather than through staged events. One quirky detail is that she sometimes carried small gifts for chicken balls, crayons, or small toys she picked up herself to create tiny moments of joy amid tragedy. These small gestures often left deep impressions on local communities. Yet even with these accomplishments, her life was far from simple. The media continued to follow her relentlessly, scrutinizing every trip, every gesture, every expression. Paparazzi loomed outside hotels and hospitals alike, capturing images for global tabloids. She learned to navigate this presence carefully, often using it to amplify the causes she championed while maintaining her own dignity. Historians still argue whether the attention enhanced her impact or added a constant layer of emotional pressure, but there is little doubt that Diana remained remarkably resilient under the glare. Her approach to humanitarian work also redefined how the public perceived the royal family. Traditionally, royals supported causes quietly, issuing statements or attending brief charity functions. Diana, by contrast, immersed herself fully. She allowed journalists access only to convey the issues she cared about, rather than to spotlight herself, a distinction that people recognized intuitively. Crowds who saw her visiting hospitals, walking through refugee camps, or comforting children sensed authenticity. They saw her human, vulnerable, and yet purposeful. This period also revealed Diana's growing understanding of how media could be used strategically. She granted interviews selectively, discussing difficult topics with honesty and care. In these appearances, she spoke about HIV, landmines, homelessness, and mental health, often framing the conversation in human terms rather than abstract policy. Her sincerity created a new standard for global engagement, influencing how public figures approached advocacy. It wasn't just her visibility, it was the emotional connection she cultivated, the way she listened as much as she spoke. At home, her life had a parallel rhythm. She maintained closeness with William and Harry, supporting them as they navigated school and adolescence. Their routines remained anchored by shared meals, bedtime rituals, and playful outings. Even amid travel and public work, she made sure that the boys felt secure and loved. She would often write letters when away, or leave small surprises in their rooms, preserving an intimate thread between mother and children in the midst of global attention. In the midst of all this, Diana also explored her personal growth. She attended classes, read extensively on subjects from international relations to social psychology, and engaged in private therapy sessions to better understand herself. She recognized the importance of emotional health not just for her, but for the people she sought to help. She sometimes reflected that public service without self-care could become unsustainable, and she quietly championed mental health before it was widely acknowledged as essential. Yet not every encounter was easy. In some countries, she confronted bureaucracies resistant to change, local systems overwhelmed by need, and cultural differences that demanded patience. But Diana approached these challenges with curiosity rather than frustration. She learned quickly, adjusted her approach, and prioritized listening. She often remarked that the lessons she gained from these experiences would stay with her far longer than any medal or formal recognition. Despite the extraordinary intensity of her travels and engagements, she maintained a striking humility. She rarely allowed herself to appear above the people she met, kneeling when speaking with children or crouching beside a patient in a hospital bed. Even the simplest gestures, touching an arm, holding a small hand, offering a reassuring smile, carried a weight of sincerity that captured the attention of the world. It was this combination of accessibility, compassion, and quiet strength that made her a global figure of hope. And so, the mid-1990s became a chapter defined not only by freedom and independence, but by the deliberate expansion of Diana's influence beyond traditional boundaries. She was no longer just a princess. She was an advocate, a voice for the vulnerable, and a figure who reshaped public expectations of leadership through empathy and action. Every handshake, every conversation, every flight across continents reinforced a life led not solely by obligation, but by conviction, care, and the courage to step forward alone if necessary to do what she believed was right. Even in the most exhausting moments-long flights, endless ceremonies, or difficult negotiations, she remained committed to her vision. She had learned to balance public and private pressures with astonishing skill, to create meaning amid scrutiny, and to maintain her humanity while inspiring others to see the world differently. In doing so, she became a figure who could not easily be contained within palace walls, headlines, or protocol, and her legacy during this period continues to resonate worldwide. And as Diana's global influence expanded, her personal life continued to evolve in ways that captured the world's attention. Her friendships deepened, especially with individuals who offered her emotional honesty and understanding without judgment. These connections provided a space where she could reflect, laugh, and breathe freely, a stark contrast to the rigid protocols of palace life. One well-known fact from this period is that she remained close to several aides and advisors from her early royal years, individuals who had witnessed both her struggles and triumphs and could speak candidly with her about everything from charity strategy to emotional well-being. Yet alongside these friendships, new relationships emerged, careful, tentative, and deeply scrutinized by the press. Her life was no longer just watched. It was dissected, and real-time photographs appeared in tabloids, sometimes taken at moments when she sought solitude. Stories circulated that blurred the line between fact and speculation. Historians still argue about the impact this relentless attention had on her emotional state, whether it encouraged her to embrace independence more boldly or simply magnified the strain she already carried. What is certain is that Diana learned quickly to navigate both intimacy and public exposure with surprising skill. Among her closest confidants, she began exploring personal connections that went beyond the superficiality she often encountered. She developed the capacity to trust again, to laugh without inhibition, and to share her private worries with those she knew cared. She valued emotional transparency, a rare quality in her world, and sought friends who mirrored her sincerity. These relationships sometimes caused tension with palace advisors, who remained protective of protocol and image, yet Diana insisted on maintaining them. In private, she often remarked that companionship rooted in honesty was a gift she refused to compromise, no matter the consequences. Despite the pressures, Diana also remained fiercely attentive to her sons. William and Harry, now older, were aware that their mother had grown into a more confident, self-assured presence. She continued the small rituals that kept them close: notes in lunch boxes, evening walks through palace gardens, bedtime conversations, and playful games. Her goal was clear: to offer her children a secure, loving foundation, even amid the swirl of public fascination and personal challenges. She believed deeply in the power of presence, of consistency, and of showing love through both words and gestures. The press's relentless attention, however, began to intrude on more intimate moments. Even walks in public spaces were photographed. Friendly interactions were dissected for narrative. Diana learned to control what she could, often moving with deliberate intention to protect both herself and her children. One little-known detail is that she sometimes staged short walks with her sons in ways that would allow them to enjoy fresh air and activity while minimizing exposure paths through side entrances, unexpected routes, and discreet moments of fun away from cameras. These small acts of strategy demonstrated her growing mastery of public life without sacrificing personal priorities. Her humanitarian work, friendships, and protective measures for her children became intertwined, forming a life that balanced duty, care, and self-expression. Diana's approach to public scrutiny was nuanced. She embraced visibility when it could help causes she cared about and minimized exposure when it threatened the safety or privacy of her family. Her actions during this period subtly reshaped expectations of public figures, demonstrating that compassion, honesty, and strategy could coexist even under the most intense scrutiny. And yet, her personal explorations, both emotional and social, carried risks. Any new connection could be misunderstood by the press or magnified into scandal. Diana navigated this territory carefully, balancing intuition with prudence. She often reflected quietly on the lessons of her early marriage, recognizing that independence required vigilance, courage, and an unwavering sense of self. These reflections informed her choices in friendships, travel, and personal life, helping her craft a rhythm that honored her values. Even amid challenges, Diana's warmth and empathy remained her defining traits. Whether she was speaking to a young mother in need, a child recovering from illness, or a close friend sharing secrets in a quiet corner of her home, she listened deeply, absorbed the stories, and responded with compassion. Her humanity became increasingly apparent not in grand gestures, but in these intimate, deliberate acts, soft touches, patient words, and small attentions that carried immense meaning. These were moments where she could shape her narrative, her identity, and her legacy through care rather than spectacle. By the late 1990s, Diana had become a figure whose life defied easy categorization. She was a mother, a humanitarian, a public figure, and a woman exploring the contours of her own independence. Her friendships, romantic awareness, and capacity for self-protection demonstrated that she could exist fully in multiple worlds at once, private and public, intimate and universal. And though the media often blurred these boundaries, she persisted in creating a life that honored both her personal truths and her global responsibilities. In this way, Diana was quietly, yet unmistakably, stepping into her own narrative, a story shaped by care, courage, and the delicate art of maintaining authenticity amid constant scrutiny. And as the late 1990s approached, Diana began sensing that her life was poised on the edge of a new chapter. The years since her divorce had brought independence, maturity, and a depth of experience few could claim, yet she felt the pull of something more, an urge to focus on long-term projects and personal fulfillment, in ways that went beyond the moment-to-moment pace of public life. She spent hours reflecting on her next steps, considering how she could create meaningful impact while continuing to raise her sons with the love and attention they needed. Her charitable focus continued to expand internationally, but she also wanted to anchor herself in projects that could endure beyond a single visit or headline. One well-known fact from this period is her work with organizations dedicated to children with disabilities and the global campaign to ban landmines, which culminated in the Nobel-recognized international campaign to ban landmines. She was deeply involved in research, personally meeting survivors, and speaking with policymakers to advocate for systemic change. Her involvement went beyond visibility. She wanted to ensure her influence created lasting results. At the same time, Diana nurtured her own personal growth. She returned to interests she had set aside, including fitness, reading, and art, but also explored new pursuits, psychology, alternative therapies, and even studying different cultural approaches to caregiving and humanitarian work. A lesser-known detail from this period is that she regularly attended small seminars and private lectures, often sitting quietly in the back, absorbing knowledge and reflecting on how it could shape her charitable strategies. These sessions gave her a sense of purpose and a grounding that balanced her high-profile life. Friendships remained central. She maintained bonds with close aides, old friends, and new acquaintances who shared her values. These relationships provided laughter, honest feedback, and emotional sustenance. She cherished quiet dinners, late-night conversations, and shared moments of humor. Things she had learned were essential for maintaining perspective amidst relentless public scrutiny. Historians still debate whether her ability to maintain these networks contributed more to her resilience than her charitable work, but it is clear that both were integral to her sense of self. Diana also grew increasingly mindful of her sons' transition into adolescence. William and Harry were navigating the complexities of schooling, peer relationships, and public awareness of their family's story. Diana remained vigilant, offering guidance while allowing them space to grow. She attended school events, organized playful activities, and emphasized the importance of empathy and resilience. These routines weren't just about normalcy. They were her way of providing stability and continuity amid a life that had often felt unpredictable. The media continued to shadow her, sometimes positively, sometimes intruding. Diana became adept at managing public attention. She would carefully plan appearances to highlight the causes she cared about, while retreating from situations that threatened her privacy. Her relationship with photographers was a delicate dance, requiring patience, strategy, and occasional defiance. She learned when to use visibility to amplify her message and when to protect herself and her family, a balance that few in her position mastered. Even in quieter moments at home, she focused on building a life that honored her values. She spent time rearranging rooms to create comfortable, nurturing spaces, ensuring William and Harry felt safe and happy. She also allowed herself moments of introspection, journaling late into the night or walking in gardens where she could think freely without interruption. These practices helped her maintain emotional equilibrium while navigating a world that often demanded constant performance. Romantic and social explorations continued cautiously. Diana was aware that any new connection would be intensely scrutinized, yet she also sought companionship and understanding. These relationships were approached with care, often nurtured quietly and intentionally, rather than in the public spotlight. Through these experiences, she learned more about her own needs and desires, recognizing the importance of authenticity, trust, and mutual respect. The late 1990s marked a subtle transformation. Diana's life, once dominated by strict expectations and public scrutiny, was evolving into something she could shape more deliberately. Her identity as a mother, humanitarian, and independent woman had solidified, and she now navigated her world with purpose and confidence. She had learned to embrace both public influence and private reflection, balancing her attention between global responsibilities and intimate personal growth. Every action, whether a quiet evening with her sons or a high-profile charitable visit, reinforced the direction she was moving in toward a life lead consciously, compassionately, and with deep awareness of the legacy she wished to leave behind. In this period of preparation, she quietly anticipated the next chapter, one where her experience, empathy, and insight could converge into a life that was fully hers, defined not by circumstance or expectation, but by intention, care, and courage. And even as the world watched, she cultivated a rhythm that allowed her to breathe, to think, and to embrace the possibilities that lay just beyond the horizon. And as the late 1990s continued, Diana's life remained a delicate balance between personal renewal and the unyielding glare of public attention. While she had cultivated independence and purpose, the world had not forgotten her, nor had it slowed its scrutiny. Every action, every smile, every glance was noticed, photographed, and dissected. This constant visibility was both a tool and a burden. She could use it to highlight causes she cared about, but it also left her little space for quiet reflection. One well-known fact is that she continued to attract massive crowds whenever she appeared, whether visiting hospitals, schools, or shelters, underscoring the global fascination with her life. The press's intensity sometimes left her feeling exposed, but she learned to navigate it with quiet strategy. Diana often approached journalists with the goal of redirecting attention toward the issues she wanted to emphasize, carefully controlling her message without compromising her authenticity. A lesser-known detail from this period is that she would occasionally leave handwritten notes for photographers, asking them to focus on her charitable work rather than personal life, a small act of reclaiming control in a relentless environment. Historians still debate whether her mastery of public perception helped her work or simply added pressure to an already demanding life, but the results were undeniable. Diana had become a symbol of compassion and engagement. At the same time, her relationships continued to evolve. She nurtured friendships and cautiously explored romantic connections, aware that the world watched every step. These relationships were approached with care and discretion, reflecting a balance of personal desire and public responsibility. Despite the scrutiny, Diana remained committed to authenticity, seeking companionship that offered genuine support rather than spectacle. She learned to protect her private world with intentionality, preserving spaces where she could relax, reflect, and be herself. Her sons remained her central focus. William and Harry were growing rapidly, and she worked to ensure they felt grounded despite their unique circumstances. She continued routines of shared meals, playful outings, and quiet evening rituals that reinforced stability and love. Diana understood the importance of modeling emotional resilience and empathy for her children, showing them how to navigate both privilege and scrutiny with grace. Even as the public eyes scrutinized her parenting, she prioritized the boys' well-being above all else. Diana's humanitarian work continued to shape her public presence. She traveled internationally, visited medical facilities, and advocated for underrepresented communities. She was deeply involved in anti-landmine campaigns, HIV awareness, and numerous children's initiatives. She immersed herself in research, listened to local communities, and sought tangible, sustainable outcomes. her hands-on approach meeting people directly, offering comfort, and observing conditions without barriers reinforced the perception of her as a compassionate, engaged public figure. Yet the increased attention brought new pressures. Paparazzi followed her everywhere, and rumors circulated incessantly. Even small personal choices became public spectacle. Diana navigated this with remarkable grace, maintaining composure while quietly asserting control over her narrative. She learned to use visibility to amplify causes while protecting her family and private life, a skill that few of her contemporaries had mastered. Within this intensity, Diana found moments of personal growth. She developed coping strategies, ranging from journaling to quiet walks, to manage stress and maintain emotional balance. She cultivated friendships that offered honesty and support, and she nurtured connections that brought laughter and perspective. In these small, deliberate moments, she preserved the parts of her life that were most meaningful: her sense of self, her children, and her commitment to humanitarian impact. By the end of this period, Diana had become a master of balancing visibility with authenticity. She could engage the world without being consumed by it, maintain intimacy amidst scrutiny, and continue her advocacy while nurturing her children and friendships. The pressures were relentless, but she had cultivated a sense of resilience that allowed her to navigate the complex intersection of personal desire, public expectation, and global responsibility. And so, Diana stood at the edge of the final phase of her story, a woman who had transformed public fascination into meaningful action, who had strengthened herself through struggle, and who remained committed to living with courage, compassion, and purpose, even under the most intense scrutiny. Her life had become a delicate interplay of exposure and privacy, action and reflection, love and responsibility, all converging toward the legacy she was quietly shaping, day by day, moment by moment. And as the final months of the 1990s unfolded, Diana's life took on a rhythm that combined remarkable independence with the ceaseless demands of public attention. She had become a figure whose presence inspired compassion, whose actions carried weight beyond the headlines, and whose influence shaped perceptions of both charity and royalty. Yet beneath the polished surface of her public image, she remained profoundly human, navigating fatigue, longing for privacy, and the delicate balance between love, family, and global responsibility. Her charitable work reached a peak during this period, with visits to international hospitals, refugee camps, and clinics, treating children and adults alike. She often arrived without ceremony, wanting to experience the conditions firsthand. One well-known fact is her continued dedication to anti-landmine campaigns, where she walked through minefields with careful guides, held survivors' hands, and spoke with policymakers to advance global awareness. The media covered these moments extensively, but Diana's focus remained on the people she encountered, not the cameras. She wanted her presence to mean something tangible, something that could ripple beyond the headlines. Private life, though, remained complicated. Diana's friendships, both old and new, became vital emotional anchors. She leaned on confidants for guidance, support, and laughed at teeny moments of normalcy in a life dominated by scrutiny. A lesser-known detail from this period is that she frequently hosted informal gatherings in her residence, inviting trusted friends for late-night tea, quiet music, and conversations that often stretched into the early hours. These private rituals offered her grounding and emotional restoration, countering the constant exposure of public life. Historians still debate whether these personal networks played a larger role in her resilience than her humanitarian achievements, but they were undeniably crucial. Her sons remained central to her focus. William and Harry were now navigating teenage years filled with both opportunity and pressure. Diana maintained routines that provided stability: school pickups, bedtime stories, weekend outings, and playful games in her garden. She used humor, patience, and attentive listening to reinforce a secure environment. Even amid travel and public commitments, she prioritized presence and connection, ensuring that her children experienced both love and consistency. Yet the scrutiny of the press never diminished. Photographers trailed her relentlessly, often attempting to capture moments meant to remain private. Diana developed strategies to protect her personal life while amplifying her advocacy. She embraced visibility when it could highlight humanitarian causes and withdrew when exposure risked personal or familial harm. Her skill at this delicate balancing act became a hallmark of her later life, reflecting both intelligence and resilience. Romantic life, while discreet, continued carefully. Diana sought connection and companionship, aware that the world watched every interaction. She valued honesty, empathy, and mutual respect, choosing to engage cautiously with those who could offer emotional understanding without spectacle. These relationships were private, intentional, and marked by a quiet joy she had long sought. At the same time, Diana cultivated personal reflection and growth. She continued reading, attending private lectures, and exploring spiritual and psychological insights. Journaling became a regular practice, offering clarity and emotional release. Long walks, quiet evenings, and moments of solitude provided space to process, dream, and plan. She had learned the importance of nurturing her inner life to sustain her outward work. As she moved forward, Diana increasingly understood her impact, not just in terms of visibility, but in the lives she touched directly. Her gestures of care, her willingness to engage intimately with suffering, and her ability to transform attention into advocacy had created a blueprint for public figures to act with empathy and effectiveness. She had become a symbol of humanity within a world of protocol, expectation, and scrutiny. And so, in this final public chapter, Diana stood poised, a mother, humanitarian, and global icon who had endured scrutiny, heartbreak, and isolation, yet emerged with remarkable courage, empathy, and self-awareness. She had cultivated independence while maintaining connection, shaped public attention into purpose, and preserved her children's emotional safety amid intense pressures. The story she had woven through decades of challenge and triumph was now entering its ultimate, poignant phase, a period that would leave a lasting imprint on the world and define her legacy in ways that transcend time, headlines, and even tragedy. And as the final months of Diana's life unfolded, the sense of purpose she had cultivated over years of struggle, growth, and compassion became more tangible than ever. She moved through her days with a quiet intensity, balancing her public engagements with private reflection, ensuring that every moment counted. Her life had become a tapestry of advocacy, love, and resilience, a complex blend of personal vulnerability and global impact. One well-known fact is that she continued to draw attention to issues often ignored, from HIV awareness to landmine eradication, creating lasting awareness that extended well beyond her immediate presence. In private, she remained deeply attentive to William and Harry. Despite the whirlwind of international travel, media attention, and public events, she carved out consistent spaces for connection, learning, and play. Her dedication to their emotional well-being reflected a lifelong commitment to nurturing and protecting the next generation. A lesser-known detail is that she maintained small, personal traditions with her son's hidden notes, favorite snacks, or improvised games that offered comfort and continuity amid the uncertainty of life in the public eye. Historians still debate the extent to which these personal practices shaped her children's resilience, but they undeniably left an imprint on their upbringing. Her friendships and personal connections continued to anchor her. She sought individuals who offered honesty, support, and companionship, recognizing that authentic relationships were essential for her own emotional health. Through these relationships, she was able to recharge, gain perspective, and maintain balance even when public scrutiny felt relentless. In turn, she offered support and guidance, lending her insight to friends, colleagues, and individuals navigating challenging circumstances of their own. Globally, her influence expanded. Every appearance, speech, or handshake conveyed empathy and connection. She met people facing unimaginable hardships, listened attentively, and acted in ways that emphasized shared humanity. The world noticed not just her royal stature, but her authenticity, compassion, and willingness to engage directly with suffering. Her visibility became a tool, transforming celebrity into advocacy, and demonstrating that prominence carried responsibility when wielded with care. Despite these accomplishments, Diana remained profoundly aware of the fragility of life and the limits of control. She moved with caution through relationships, travel, and public exposure, yet she never allowed fear to prevent action. Her ability to balance courage with prudence became one of her defining traits, shaping both her legacy and the lives of those she touched directly. Even small gestures, a comforting touch, a reassuring word, a shared laugh carried immense meaning, embodying a philosophy that human connection, care, and empathy are powerful agents of change. As her story neared its tragic conclusion, the groundwork she had laid ensured that her influence would persist. She had redefined what it meant to be a royal, a public figure, and a humanitarian. She had shown that vulnerability can coexist with strength, that personal growth can exist alongside public scrutiny, and that love and compassion can shape a legacy far larger than the individual. Her life, in all its complexity, became a blueprint for empathy, courage, and self-awareness in a world often dominated by appearances and expectation. And so, Diana's final chapter, though brief, was marked by intention and impact. She embodied the lessons of her life, the importance of presence, of love, of emotional honesty, and of courage in the face of scrutiny. She had transformed challenges into purpose, heartbreak into compassion, and visibility into a platform for change. As she moved through her final days, she left a world touched by her warmth, her authenticity, and her unwavering dedication to both family and humanity. The story she had lived, filled with triumphs, struggles, growth, and love, resonates still, a timeless reflection of what it means to live with courage, heart, and empathy. And now, as we reach the very end of Diana's story, it is time to pause and breathe, letting the life she lived settle softly around us. Her journey was filled with light and shadow, moments of joy and moments of profound challenge. Yet through it all, she remained deeply human, tender, compassionate, and endlessly curious about the world and the people within it. She taught us that vulnerability is not weakness, that love and empathy can ripple far beyond the boundaries we expect, and that even in the brightest spotlight, quiet strength matters most. We can imagine her walking through gardens at Kensington, the soft rustle of leaves underfoot, a faint smile playing on her lips as she reflects on the lives she touched, the children she comforted, and the changes she helped inspire. We can picture her laughter echoing softly in a quiet room shared with her sons, small gestures of love forming invisible threads that bind a family together even across distance and time. The rooms she inhabited were filled with both history and intimacy, spaces where her humanity was fully expressed, despite the eyes of the world constantly watching. Her legacy continues not only through her children and charitable causes, but through the countless people who remember her warmth, her courage, and her ability to connect deeply with others. It is a reminder that even amidst scrutiny, adversity, and heartbreak, a life lived with intention, empathy, and presence leaves a lasting imprint. And so we can let her story fade gently, carrying with us the quiet lessons of her life. That compassion matters, that courage is quiet as often as it is bold, and that human connection endures beyond headlines, beyond images, beyond time. Now, let your mind rest, imagining Diana's calm smile, the soft warmth of her presence, and the enduring echo of a life lived fully, with heart and purpose. Let the gentle rhythm of her story lull you into a peaceful state, as we close this chapter together, leaving her memory to drift softly into the quiet of the night.